They say a man becomes dangerous the moment he stops caring what the world thinks of him. Duke Cadric Ravenshade crossed that line the night he walked away from everything society demanded and chose the one woman they said he couldn't have. This isn't some fairy tale about love conquering all. This is about power, possession, and what happens when a ruthless man finally finds something worth burning the entire kingdom down to protect. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to witness will shatter every assumption you have about strength and surrender. Drop a like if you're ready to see a duke choose chaos over compromise, and comment which city you're watching from, because this story is about to get brutal. The northern wind carried the smell of blood and salt water through the cracked windows of Blackthorn Keep. Inside the war room, Duke Cadric Ravenshade stood before a map of Valamont with his hands braced against the oak table, knuckles white with controlled fury. 3 red markers indicated where rebel forces had positioned themselves. 12 black crosses showed where his own men had died in the last fortnight. "They think I'm weak," he said without looking up. His voice cut through the candlelit chamber like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "They think scandal makes a man vulnerable." Lord Garrett Thorne, his oldest military advisor, shifted uncomfortably near the fireplace. The scar running down the left side of his weathered face looked particularly stark in the flickering light. He had served 3 generations of Ravenshade rulers and had never seen one as coldly calculating as the man before him now. "Your Grace, the southern houses are calling for your abdication. They say your judgment has been compromised by By what, Garrett?" Cadric's pale gray eyes lifted from the map with surgical precision. "Say it clearly." Garrett's jaw tightened. "By obsession with a woman beneath your station." The Duke's laugh held no humor whatsoever. It was the sound of something dark and ancient finally given permission to surface. He straightened to his full height, and even men who had fought beside him in 3 wars took an involuntary step backward. "Beneath my station?" Cadric repeated slowly, tasting each word like poison. "They reduce everything to bloodlines and birth records as if those things matter when the wolves come howling at your gates." He turned toward the window where storm clouds gathered over the violent sea. "Let me tell you something about stations, old friend. I've killed men with noble blood who died begging like cowards. I've seen peasant soldiers hold defensive lines when lords fled on horseback. Station is a fiction we tell ourselves to maintain order among people too weak to survive without it. Your father would never have. My father married for alliances and produced an heir before 30. Kedric's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying. He also died alone in this very room, surrounded by advisors who smiled to his face while counting the days until his funeral. Don't lecture me about duty using a dead man's playbook. Garrett said nothing. There was nothing safe left to say. Outside, thunder rolled across Blackthorn's ancient battlements. Cadric stared into the storm with the expression of a man who had already decided how this would end. Mercy was a luxury he could no longer afford. Restraint had been mistaken for weakness. Now they would remember why the Ravenshade name had ruled the North for 8 generations without ever bending to southern politics or royal pressure. He thought of her constantly now. Serafina. Even her name felt like a wound reopening every time his mind circled back to the Winter Ascension Ball 3 months ago. The way she had stepped between him and what he wanted with that devastating smile, sacrificing her own heart to protect her sister's reputation. The way she had looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that saw past every layer of armor he wore like ceremonial dress. Most women feared him. A few desired the power he represented. Serafina had done neither. She had simply seen him as he actually was, stripped of titles and territory and terror, and hadn't turned away. That was the part that haunted him during council meetings and battle preparations. Not her beauty, though she possessed a quiet elegance that could stop his breath if he let it. Not her cleverness, though she analyzed court politics with more precision than half his military commanders. It was the fact that she had witnessed the violence simmering beneath his skin every moment of every day, the constant calculation of who to trust and who to eliminate, the exhaustion of ruling through fear, and her expression had held only understanding, not pity, not horror. Understanding. "The rebels will march before summer," Garrett said carefully, breaking the loaded silence. "Lord Matthias has promised his forces to Duke Fenwick. That gives them control of the eastern trade routes and enough men to challenge us openly. Kadric turned from the window. When he spoke again, the coldness in his tone could have frozen the sea itself. Good. Let them come. I'm tired of pretending we can resolve this with negotiation and political theater. He moved toward the war table with the fluid grace of a predator who had already decided his prey was dead. Send word to Captain Varen. I want every approach to Blackthorn fortified within the week. Double the night watch. Execute anyone caught carrying messages for the southern houses without proper authorization. Execute. Garrett's eyebrows rose slightly. Your Grace, that will only confirm what they already believe about me? Kadric's smile belonged to something far more dangerous than any human expression should contain. I stopped caring about their opinions the moment I refused to marry a woman I didn't want for the sake of alliances that would have strangled me within a decade. They've already decided I'm mad. Let's give them something real to fear. He traced the route between Blackthorn and the capital with one gloved finger, calculating distances and defensive positions with the ruthless efficiency that had won him 3 border wars before his 25th birthday. People forgot that beneath the formal coats and political maneuvering lived a man who had taken his first life at 16 during a siege that left half his garrison dead, and his father's legacy secured through sheer brutality. What about Lady Seraphina? Garrett's question hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Everything inside Kadric went absolutely still. When he looked up again, there was something raw and unfinished in his eyes that made the old soldier take another step backward, despite 30 years of military discipline. What about her? The court assumes you'll eventually— The court, Kadric interrupted with deadly precision, can assume whatever helps them sleep at night. But understand this, Garrett, I didn't walk away from that ballroom because I lost interest. I walked away because if I had stayed another moment watching her sacrifice herself for her sister's honor, I would have torn that entire palace apart with my bare hands and claimed her in front of every noble house in Valamont, regardless of the consequences. His words fell like stones into deep water, creating ripples of implication that spread through every corner of the chamber. She made her choice, he continued, each syllable edged with something close to grief. She chose her family's reputation over everything we both knew was happening between us. And I will respect that decision until the day someone puts a sword through my chest. But don't mistake respect for indifference. Don't assume that because I haven't ridden to the capital and dragged her back here by force, I've somehow moved past this. So set. Garrett opened his mouth, then closed it again. Some truths were too large to argue with. The Duke returned his attention to the war map with the same focused intensity he brought to every problem that required solving through violence or strategy. We have 6 weeks before the rebels feel confident enough to march. That gives us time to consolidate our position and remind the southern houses why Blackthorn has never fallen to siege or assault in 800 years. And if Lady Seraphina— Don't! The single word cut through the air like an executioner's axe. Don't finish that sentence unless you want to test how much patience I have left today. Outside, rain began hammering against the fortress walls with increasing fury. Lightning illuminated the war room in stark flashes that turned everything into shadow and harsh silver light. Kadric stood motionless before the map, a dark figure carved from stone in unspoken rage, already calculating how many men he would need to kill before this was finished. Because it would finish, one way or another. Either the rebel houses would bend, or he would break them so completely that their grandchildren would still whisper about the price of challenging Blackthorn's authority. But beneath the tactical planning and controlled violence, a different war continued raging. One that had nothing to do with territory or politics or bloodlines. One that centered entirely on a woman who had walked away from him 3 months ago and still occupied every thought he tried desperately not to have. The door to the war room opened without warning. Captain Varen entered with rain streaming from his black cloak, his young face grim beneath the hood. He was barely 26, but had earned his rank through demonstrated brutality during the border conflicts that most nobles preferred to ignore. Your Grace, he bowed quickly. We have a situation. Kadric's expression didn't change, but something in his posture sharpened with predatory focus. Speak. Riders approached the eastern gate an hour ago under a flag of truce. They claimed to carry a message from House Vale. The name hit Caedric like a physical blow, though he absorbed it without visible reaction. Garrett and Varen both watched him carefully, waiting to see which version of the Duke would emerge, the controlled politician or the barely restrained savage. From Lord Vale himself? His voice remained perfectly level. No, Your Grace. Varen hesitated, and that hesitation told Caedric everything he needed to know before the captain spoke again. From Lady Evelyn Vale, she's requesting an audience. Tonight. The silence that followed could have shattered glass. Evelyn, the woman society had chosen for him. The woman he had publicly refused 3 months ago in a scandal that was still echoing through every noble house from the northern coast to the southern provinces. The woman whose sister had become the ghost haunting every moment of his waking life. She's here. Caedric's words came out too quiet, too controlled. At Blackthorn? What? Waiting in the outer courtyard with 2 guards and a lady's maid. She came alone, Your Grace, without her father's permission or knowledge. Garrett stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword by pure instinct. This could be a trap. The southern houses might be using her as... No. Caedric shook his head once, decisively. Evelyn Vale is many things, but she's not stupid enough to participate in an assassination attempt. Not after what happened at the Ascension Ball. He turned toward the window again, rain lashing against the ancient stone. She's here for a different reason. Which is? Varen asked. Caedric's reflection in the rain-streaked glass looked like something carved from darkness and barely controlled fury. When he spoke, his voice held the weight of absolute certainty. Seraphina. The name hung between them like a prayer and a curse simultaneously. Admit Lady Evelyn, he said after a moment that stretched into eternity. Bring her to the throne room. And Varen, make sure your men understand that whatever happens next, no word of this meeting leaves Blackthorn. I don't care if you have to cut out tongues to ensure silence. Am I clear? Perfectly, Your Grace. After the captain departed, Garrett remained behind. The old soldier's expression carried the same concern he'd shown when Caedric had been 16 and bleeding from a dozen wounds after his first real battle, more terrified of his father's disappointment than actual death. Caedric. The use of his given name without title indicated just how worried Garrett truly was. Whatever she's about to tell you, will change nothing, the Duke finished coldly. The rebel houses have already committed to their course. Evelyn's arrival is just another variable in an equation that only ends one way. I'm not talking about the rebellion. Caedric met his old friend's gaze directly. Then what are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I've known you since you were a boy who cried when your mother died. I watched you transform into the hardest man I've ever served under. I've seen you make decisions that would destroy weaker rulers. Garrett's voice dropped. But I've never seen you look the way you did that night at the ball. When Lady Seraphina stepped between you and what you wanted, that wasn't calculation or strategy, boy. That was a man realizing he'd finally found something he couldn't conquer through force. For a long moment, Caedric said nothing. Thunder crashed directly overhead, shaking dust from the ancient rafters. When he finally spoke, his words came out raw and unfinished. She was standing under that archway in a silver gown, looking like she wanted to disappear into the shadows entirely. And all I could think was that I would burn every throne in Valamont if it meant she'd stop trying to be invisible. His hands curled into fists against the window frame. His hands curled into a... Then she smiled at me with her heart breaking right there in her eyes and guided me toward Evelyn like I was some mindless fool who couldn't see what she was doing. Like I didn't understand that she was destroying herself to protect her family's reputation. So why didn't you fight for her? Because she asked me not to. The confession came out like an admission of defeat, not with words, but everything in her expression was begging me to let her make that sacrifice. And I'd rather cut off my own hand than force her into choosing between me and her family's survival. Garrett absorbed this in thoughtful silence. Finally, he nodded once. The throne room, then. The throne room, Caedric confirmed. Let's find out what Evelyn Vale thinks is important enough to risk traveling through rebel territory to tell me. The throne room of Blackthorn Keep had witnessed 8 generations of Ravenshade justice. which was a polite way of saying it had seen enough executions, judgments, and brutal political maneuvering to soak its stones in the memory of violence. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls. The ancient seat of power sat elevated on a stone dais, carved from a single piece of black marble that legend claimed had been salvaged from a fallen star. Kaedric didn't sit on the throne. That would have been too formal, too distant. Instead, he stood before it with his hands clasped behind his back, posture military straight, expression carefully neutral. He had changed into a formal black coat with silver threading that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than civilized. The scar on his left cheek stood out starkly in the torchlight. The massive doors opened with a groan of ancient hinges. Lady Eveline Vale entered, flanked by two of Varen's guards, and even travel-stained and clearly exhausted. She carried herself with the practiced grace that had made her the diamond of 3 consecutive social seasons. Her golden hair was pulled back severely. Her traveling dress was dark blue, almost black, and bore mud stains from hard riding. But her green eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had always made Kaedric respect her even if he'd never desired her. She stopped 10 paces from the dais and executed a perfect curtsy despite obvious fatigue. "Your Grace, Lady Evelyn," Kaedric's voice carried through the chamber with formal coldness. "You've traveled far in dangerous times to request an audience without advance notice. I assume your reasons are compelling?" She straightened, meeting his gaze directly in a way most people avoided. That was one thing he'd always appreciated about her. Evelyn Vale didn't cower, even when standing before a man who could destroy her family with a single word to the right council members. "May we speak privately, Your Grace?" Kaedric considered this. Protocol suggested he refuse. Wisdom suggested he keep witnesses. But curiosity, and something deeper he didn't want to examine too closely, made him gesture toward the guards. "Leave us!" Garrett, standing near the side entrance, hesitated. Kaedric gave him a look that said he would tolerate no argument. The old soldier bowed stiffly and departed with the others. The doors closed with a boom that echoed through the empty chamber. Silence settled between them like a living thing. "You were supposed to marry me," Evelyn said finally, her voice steady despite everything. "Society had already planned the wedding. My father had negotiated the contracts. And then you stood in front of the entire royal court and refused the match so publicly that my family has spent 3 months attempting to salvage our reputation." Kaedric's expression didn't flicker. "If you've come seeking an apology, I've come to thank you." Shit. That stopped him completely. Evelyn stepped closer, and now he could see the exhaustion carved into her features, not just from travel, but from months of carrying a burden she'd never wanted in the first place. "I never wanted to marry you, Your Grace. I agreed because my father demanded it, because society expected it, because refusing a duke would have destroyed our house politically." She paused, choosing her next words with obvious care. "But I also knew from the first time you looked at me with those cold eyes that I would spend my entire life trying to earn affection from a man who felt absolutely nothing beyond political obligation." "Then why agree at all?" Kaedric's question came out sharper than intended. "Because I didn't know there was another option." Evelyn's smile carried genuine sadness. "Until I watched you cross that ballroom toward my sister with an expression I'd never seen on your face before. And I realized that the cold, controlled duke everyone feared was capable of something I'd never imagined. Which was obsession." The word fell between them like a confession. Not love, not yet maybe, but absolute, undeniable obsession with someone who looked at you the same way when she thought no one was watching. Kaedric's jaw tightened fractionally. "You're mistaken. I'm not." Evelyn moved closer still, close enough now that he could see the determination burning behind her exhaustion. "I've spent 3 months watching my younger sister slowly disappear into herself. She won't eat properly. She barely sleeps. She's turned down 3 marriage proposals from suitable matches because she can't stop remembering the way you looked at her that night before she stepped between you and your decision." Something dangerous flickered through Kaedric's expression. "Serafina refused marriage proposals?" "She refused everything, Your Grace. She's become a ghost in our own household. And when I finally confronted her about it 2 weeks ago, she broke down and told me the truth." Evelyn's voice dropped. "She's in love with you. Desperately. Completely. hopelessly in love with a man she believes she can never have because she made the choice to protect our family's reputation. The silence that followed was so absolute that Kedrick could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Why are you telling me this?" His words came out hoarse, unfinished. "Because I'm about to marry Lord Aldrich Greymont next month," Evelyn said steadily. "A man I actually care for, who courted me properly after the scandal died down, enough for society to stop whispering. And I realized something important before committing to that future, which is that Serafina sacrificed herself for me once. She stepped between you and happiness because she believed my reputation mattered more than her own heart." Evelyn's green eyes held his without flinching. "Now it's my turn to return the favor. I'm here to release you both from whatever honor-bound silence you think you owe me or my family." Kedrick stared at her as if she'd just grown a second head. "You rode through rebel territory to tell me you approve?" "Oh, I rode through rebel territory," Evelyn corrected carefully, to tell you that the woman you want is currently sitting in our family estate believing she destroyed your life and her sister's future by being selfish enough to fall in love with the wrong man. And that maybe, just maybe, the fearsome Duke of Blackthorn could find the courage to stop respecting her sacrifice and start fighting for her instead. Everything inside Kedrick went absolutely still. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of mountains moving. "Does she know you're here?" "No. She would have stopped me if she did. Serafina still believes the right choice is to disappear quietly and let you marry someone politically advantageous." Evelyn's expression softened fractionally. "But I know my sister, Your Grace, and I know that if you don't come for her soon, she'll eventually accept some noble's proposal just to stop feeling this way. And you'll spend the rest of your life ruling through fear while slowly dying inside because you let honor destroy the only thing you've ever actually wanted." Kedrick turned away from her, staring up at the throne that had demanded so much from 8 generations of his family. Power, control, ruthless decision-making, and the willingness to sacrifice everything personal for political stability. His father had lived by those rules. His grandfather, too, an unbroken line of men who had ruled brilliantly and died alone with nothing but legacy to warm their beds. "I've killed men for threatening Blackthorn," he said quietly. "I've made decisions that haunt me during every moment I'm not actively distracted by war or politics. I've become exactly the monster society needs to maintain order in the North." "I know," Evelyn agreed. "Then you understand why Serafina deserves better than that." "I understand that my sister doesn't want better." Evelyn's voice hardened with unexpected steel. "She wants you, exactly as you are, monster and all. Monster." Kedrick closed his eyes against the wave of longing that crashed through him with devastating force. He thought of Serafina's quiet intelligence, the way she moved through crowds like water finding paths around obstacles, her compassion toward people society ignored, the understanding in her eyes when he'd admitted that mercy without strength only taught enemies where to place the knife. "The southern houses are preparing to march against Blackthorn," he said finally. "Within 6 weeks, we'll be at war. This fortress will be under siege. Bringing her here now would put her directly in danger." "Then maybe you should end the war quickly." Evelyn smiled with surprising ruthlessness. "I've heard stories about the Duke of Blackthorn in battle, Your Grace. They say you fight like something unchained, like a man with absolutely nothing left to lose." "Those stories are accurate." "Good." Evelyn moved toward the door, her message delivered. "Because now you have something to fight for that matters more than territory or legacy or political stability. Now you have a reason to win so overwhelming that nothing the Southern houses throw at you could possibly stand in your way." She paused with her hand on the massive door handle. She paused with her, looking back over her shoulder with an expression that held unexpected warmth. "Serafina told me once that she felt invisible her entire life until the moment your eyes found her under that archway. She said it was like finally being seen after years of existing as a shadow everyone looked through." Evelyn's smile turned genuine. "Don't make her wait much longer to feel that way again, Your Grace. Some things are worth burning kingdoms for." Then she was gone, leaving Kedrick alone in the ancient throne room with a decision that would reshape everything. He found Garrett at the war room an hour later, still studying the tactical maps with the dedication of a soldier who had survived 3 decades through preparation rather than luck. "Send word to Captain Veron," Kaedric said without preamble. "I want every military asset we control mobilized within 48 hours. Call in every favor, every alliance, every blood debt owed to House Ravenshade for the last 3 generations." Garrett looked up sharply. "You're advancing the timeline? The rebel houses want a war?" Kedric's smile belonged to something far more predatory than human. "Then let's give them one they'll remember for centuries, but we're not waiting for them to march. We're going to hit them first, hit them hard, and end this before summer." "Your Grace, that's insane," Kedric finished coldly. "Probably, but I'm tired of playing defense while ambitious nobles think my distraction makes me vulnerable. Time to remind Valamont why Blackthorn has never fallen." "Ma-san." Garrett studied him carefully, seeing something in the Duke's expression that made the old soldier's eyes widen with sudden understanding. "This is about Lady Seraphina. This," Kedric corrected with absolute certainty, "is about finishing a war fast enough that I can ride to the capital without worrying about assassins striking while I'm gone. This is about crushing the rebellion so completely that no noble house will dare question my judgment when I claim the woman I should have chosen 3 months ago. And if she refuses you, betrayen asapayis proitar periso." Kedric's laugh held genuine humor for the first time in months. "Then I'll have cleared the political obstacles for nothing and can return to ruling through fear and isolation. But at least I'll know I tried." Outside, storm clouds continued gathering over Blackthorn Keep. Thunder rolled across the violent northern sea. And inside the war room, Duke Kedric Ravenshade began planning a campaign that would either secure his future or destroy everything he'd spent his life building. He thought of Seraphina sitting alone in her family estate, believing she'd made the right choice by stepping away from what they both wanted. He thought of her dark, intelligent eyes and quiet strength, and the understanding she'd shown when everyone else only saw his ruthlessness. Then he stopped thinking entirely and focused on the only thing that mattered now: winning fast enough to claim her before she disappeared completely into the shadows where she'd spent her entire life hiding. The war began 3 days later when Blackthorn forces struck the eastern trade routes with overwhelming brutality. And in the capital city of Valamon, Lady Seraphina Vale heard the news and felt her heart stop because she knew exactly what it meant. The Duke was coming, and nothing in heaven or hell would stop him this time. The war came faster than anyone expected, and hit harder than even the most pessimistic military advisors had predicted. Duke Kedric Ravenshade didn't march his forces toward rebellion with the measured caution of a ruler concerned about casualties or political fallout. He moved like a storm given human form, brutal and unstoppable, with Captain Veron leading the vanguard and Garrett coordinating supply lines that stretched across 3 provinces. The first engagement happened at dawn near the Thornwood Pass, where Lord Matthias had positioned 200 men to block the northern route. They never stood a chance. Blackthorn forces hit them from 3 directions simultaneously, overwhelming defensive positions before most soldiers even finished pulling on their armor. The survivors fled back toward the eastern territories, carrying stories about the Duke, fighting at the front of every charge with a savagery that seemed almost inhuman. Kedric killed 7 men personally during that first battle. Not from horseback with the detached efficiency of a commander directing troops, but on foot with a longsword that moved through flesh and bone like water cutting through sand. His black coat became stained crimson within the first hour. Blood sprayed across his face when he drove his blade through the throat of a captain who'd been foolish enough to think noble birth provided protection from consequences. Standing over the body afterward, breathing hard in the cold morning air, Kedric felt nothing resembling remorse. This was what ruling required when people mistook restraint for weakness. This was the language power understood when negotiation and political maneuvering failed to maintain order. He'd been bred for this from childhood, trained to see violence not as a moral failing, but as a necessary tool for survival in a world where hesitation got you killed and mercy only taught enemies where to strike next. But beneath the tactical calculations and controlled brutality, one thought burned through everything else with relentless intensity. Seraphina. Her name had become a mantra during combat, a focal point that kept him moving forward when exhaustion tried dragging him down. Every enemy he cut through represented another obstacle removed between him and the woman who'd walked away 3 months ago believing she was doing the right thing. Every hour spent ending this rebellion quickly was 1 hour closer to riding back to the capital and, making her understand that honor and sacrifice meant nothing if they destroyed what actually mattered. He wanted her with an intensity that bordered on obsession, not the polite desire of a nobleman courting someone appropriate, something raw, more primal. The kind of need that lived in the same space where violence and possession overlapped into territory most people were too civilized to acknowledge existed. Kaedric understood himself well enough to know this wasn't healthy by conventional standards. A normal man would have accepted her refusal with grace and moved on to politically advantageous matches. A rational ruler would prioritize stability over personal desire, but he'd stop pretending to be either of those things the moment Serafina had looked at him beneath that marble archway with understanding in her dark eyes, seen past every layer of control and ruthlessness to whatever remained human underneath. She'd seen the monster and hadn't turned away. That changed everything. By the third day of fighting, Blackthorn forces had secured the eastern trade routes and were advancing toward Duke Fenwick's stronghold with overwhelming momentum. Rebel casualties numbered in the hundreds. Kaedric's own losses were minimal, achieved through brutal efficiency and the willingness to commit violence on a scale that made even his own soldiers uncomfortable. He sat in a commandeered manor house that evening, reviewing tactical reports while servants cleaned blood from his armor in an adjacent room. The landowner who'd sworn allegiance to the rebellion was currently locked in his own dungeon awaiting trial, which was a polite way of saying execution once this was finished. Captain Varen entered without knocking, his young face grim beneath dried blood and dirt. He'd proven himself a dozen times over during the past 72 hours, fighting with the kind of focused aggression that came from having nothing to lose and everything to prove. Your Grace, we've received word from Duke Fenwick. He's requesting a parley. Kaedric didn't look up from the map spread across the dining table. Tell him no. Your Grace, traditionally means nothing when the enemy is trying to buy time to regroup. Kaedric's voice remained absolutely level. Fenwick wants to negotiate because he's realized he can't win through direct confrontation. But I'm not interested in negotiation. I want this finished. Varen hesitated, which told Kaedric the captain had more to say, but was calculating how much honesty his duke would tolerate right now. Speak plainly, Kaedric ordered without looking up. I don't have patience for courtesies tonight. The men are starting to talk, Your Grace. They're saying you're fighting like someone possessed, that you're taking unnecessary risks during engagements. And what do you think? Varen met his gaze directly with the kind of blunt courage that had earned him his rank. I think you're fighting like a man who needs this war over yesterday, and I think everyone in the command structure knows it has something to do with what happened at the Winter Ascension Ball. Silence stretched between them, while Kaedric considered how much truth to acknowledge. Outside, night had fallen completely. Rain drummed against the windows with steady persistence. Somewhere in the distance, wounded men screamed while surgeons worked by candlelight to save what could be saved. 3 months ago, Kaedric said finally, his words measured and deliberate, I stood in front of the entire royal court and refused a match that would have secured valuable alliances because the woman society chose for me wasn't the woman I wanted. That decision made me look weak to ambitious nobles who've spent their entire lives waiting for an opening to challenge Blackthorn's authorities. He stood slowly, moving toward the rain-streaked window with controlled precision. His reflection looked like something carved from shadow and barely contained violence. So now I'm making certain every house in Valamont understands exactly how weak I actually am, which is to say, not at all. This rebellion ends within the week, decisively and brutally, so that no one will dare question my judgment again for the next 3 generations. And after the rebellion? Varen asked carefully. Kaedric's smile belonged to something far more dangerous than any expression should contain. After the rebellion, I'm riding to the capital to claim what I should have taken 3 months ago. And if anyone tries to stop me, I'll add their house to the list of families that no longer exist. The captain absorbed this with the kind of calm acceptance soldiers developed after seeing enough combat to understand that some battles were already decided before they began. The men will follow you, Your Grace. They always do. I know. That's why we're going to win. After Varen departed, Kaedric remained at the window staring into the storm. Thunder rolled across the countryside. Lightning illuminated fields where bodies would need collecting come morning. He thought about Serafina hearing news of the fighting and wondering what it meant. Whether she understood that every enemy he killed was another step closer to reaching her. The truth was simpler and more complicated than tactical necessity. He needed to finish this war quickly because staying away from her any longer felt like dying slowly from a wound that wouldn't heal. Because every night spent commanding troops and making brutal decisions only reinforced how much he wanted someone who could look at the blood on his hands without flinching. Serafina had done that already. She'd witnessed the violence simmering beneath his control during those quiet conversations in forgotten libraries while he courted her sister. She'd heard him admit that mercy without strength only taught enemies where to place the knife. And her expression had held understanding instead of horror. That was worth burning kingdoms for. The siege of Fenwick Keep began 4 days later under heavy rain that turned the surrounding fields into mud and made siege equipment difficult to position. Duke Fenwick had retreated behind his walls with what remained of his forces, roughly 300 men who'd sworn oaths to defend their lord even if it meant death. Caedric gave them one chance to surrender. A herald rode to the gates carrying terms written in Caedric's own hand. They were simple and non-negotiable. Fenwick could open his gates, surrender command, and face trial for treason. Or Blackthorn forces would take the keep by storm and execute every defender found under arms. The herald returned 2 hours later with Duke Fenwick's response delivered verbally because the southern noble apparently thought dramatic gestures carried weight during war. The Duke of Blackthorn can go to hell. Caedric read the report standing in his command tent while rain hammered the canvas overhead. Garrett stood nearby looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested he was about to offer advice his duke wouldn't want to hear. "Say it," Caedric ordered flatly. "Fenwick Keep has stood for 400 years, Your Grace. Those walls are 12 feet thick at the base. Even with siege equipment, we're looking at weeks of bombardment before we can breach them effectively." "We don't have weeks." Caedric's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more terrifying. "We have 3 days before word of the siege reaches the capital and politicians start trying to negotiate peace terms that will undermine everything we've accomplished." "Then what do you suggest?" Caedric turned to face his oldest advisor with an expression that made Garrett take an involuntary step backward despite 3 decades of military discipline. "We're taking that keep tonight, by force, through the front gates if they open them, through the walls if they don't." "Your Grace, that's suicide for anyone leading the assault." "Then it's fortunate I'll be leading it personally." The words fell like stones into deep water. Garrett's face went pale beneath his weathered tan. Even Varen, standing near the tent entrance, looked shocked. "You can't seriously—" "I can and I will." Caedric's tone allowed no argument. "Fenwick wants to make this a siege? Fine, but I'm ending it tonight with overwhelming violence so brutal that every surviving rebel will spend the rest of their lives regretting they ever challenged Blackthorn's authority." He moved to the tactical map spread across the camp table, already calculating approach vectors and defensive weak points with the kind of focused intensity that had won him 3 border wars before his 25th birthday. "Varen, I want assault teams positioned at 3 entry points. Use explosives on the secondary gate. It's older construction and will collapse faster than the main entrance. Garrett, you'll coordinate archers to provide covering fire once we're inside. No one sleeps tonight. We move at midnight when their watch is most likely to be exhausted. And if the assault fails—" Garrett's question came out hoarse. Caedric looked up from the map with pale gray eyes that held absolutely no uncertainty whatsoever. "It won't fail, because I'm not leaving that keep until Fenwick is dead or kneeling, and every man in my command knows I'll walk through hell itself before accepting defeat." The attack began exactly at midnight under a moonless sky that provided perfect cover for troops moving into position. Explosives detonated against the secondary gate with a roar that shook the entire fortress. Stone and timber erupted outward in a shower of deadly fragments. Before defenders could respond effectively, Blackthorn forces poured through the breach with Caedric at the front of the assault. What followed wasn't battle in any conventional sense. It was controlled slaughter, executed with mechanical efficiency. Caedric moved through the chaos like something unchained, his sword cutting through defenders with brutal precision. Blood sprayed across ancient stone. Men screamed and died in the narrow corridors while fire spread through the inner keep. He took an arrow through his left shoulder during the first hour, but kept fighting without breaking stride. Pain was just information. Something to acknowledge and compartmentalize while focusing on the only thing that mattered, which was ending this quickly enough to survive reaching Serafina. Duke Fenwick made his final stand in the throne room, surrounded by his remaining guards. He was a heavy man in his 50s who'd grown soft from years of political maneuvering instead of actual combat. When Caedric kicked open the doors with blood streaming from multiple wounds, Fenwick's face went white with terror. "You're insane," the Southern Duke whispered, staring at the crimson-soaked figure advancing toward him with relentless purpose. This was supposed to be civilized. Negotiations, political pressure. Not this. Caedric's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "You wanted to test whether scandal made me weak. Consider this your answer." Some see so. Fenwick's guards rushed forward. 3 men died within seconds. The 4th managed to score a cut across Caedric's ribs before taking a sword through the chest. Then there was only silence, broken by labored breathing and the sound of fire consuming the keep around them. "Please," Fenwick begged, dropping to his knees. "I'll surrender. I'll swear loyalty. Just don't do—" "You should have thought about that before sending assassins to Blackthorn." Caedric's voice remained absolutely level, despite blood loss and exhaustion. "Before joining a rebellion based on the assumption that my distraction made me vulnerable. Before forgetting that Ravenshade rulers have held the North for 8 generations by doing exactly what I'm about to do now." Which is? Making an example that will be remembered for centuries. The execution was quick, but public. Caedric dragged Fenwick to the courtyard where surviving defenders had been forced to kneel in rows. Then he took the Southern Duke's head personally, while rain washed blood across ancient cobblestones. Standing over the body afterward, barely able to remain upright from wounds and exhaustion, Caedric addressed the captured soldiers with a voice that carried through the entire fortress despite its raw edge. "Tell everyone what happened here tonight. Tell them the Duke of Blackthorn doesn't negotiate with traitors. Tell them that the next house to challenge my authority will face the same fate. And tell them that I'm done pretending mercy is anything except weakness that gets you killed." Then he collapsed, and everything went black. Caedric woke 3 days later in his own bed at Blackthorn Keep with bandages covering most of his torso and his left arm immobilized in a sling. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Someone had cleaned him up and changed him into fresh clothing while he was unconscious. Garrett sat in a chair beside the bed, looking older than his years. When he noticed Caedric's eyes were open, relief flooded across his weathered features. "Welcome back, Your Grace. The surgeons weren't certain you'd survive the blood loss." Caedric's voice came out hoarse and rough. "The rebellion? Crushed. Completely. Every major house involved has either surrendered or been destroyed. The remaining southern nobles are falling over themselves to swear renewed loyalty." Garrett's expression held grim satisfaction. "You succeeded, boy. No one will dare challenge Blackthorn's authority for the next 3 generations at minimum." Desarmarasi. Good. That was good. Caedric's tactical mind filed away the information while his body screamed protest at every small movement. He'd pushed himself harder during the siege than even his considerable tolerance for pain could sustain. The arrow wound in his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat. His ribs felt like broken glass grinding together. But none of that mattered because the war was over, and that meant, "How long until I can ride?" The question came out sharp with urgency. Garrett's eyebrows rose. "Your Grace, you nearly died. The surgeons recommend at least 2 weeks of—" "How long until I can sit a horse without reopening these wounds?" Understanding dawned across the old soldier's face. "You're serious. You're actually going to ride for the capital in your condition." "I'm riding for the capital the moment I can stay conscious long enough to reach it." Caedric forced himself upright despite the explosion of pain that followed. "So answer the question, Garrett. How long?" 3 days if you don't care about permanent damage. A week if you want to survive the journey. 3 days, then? Garrett opened his mouth to argue. Garrett saw the expression on Caedric's face and closed it again. Some battles were already decided before they began. "She might refuse you, Your Grace, after everything that's happened. After the violence and bloodshed and brutality you just displayed ending this rebellion." Caedric met his oldest friend's gaze with absolute certainty. "Then I'll deal with that rejection when it happens. But I'm not staying here wondering what might have been possible if I just found the courage to fight for her instead of respecting a sacrifice neither of us actually wanted." Over the next 72 hours, Blackthorn Keep transformed from a fortress preparing for prolonged war into something resembling normal operations. Troops returned from the field carrying stories about the Duke's brutality during combat. Nobles sent increasingly desperate messages pledging loyalty, and Caedric pushed himself through recovery with single-minded determination that worried everyone around him. He could barely lift his left arm. His ribs protested every breath. Walking across his chambers required concentration to avoid passing out from pain and blood loss. But none of that mattered because Serafina was 3 days hard riding away, and he'd already wasted 3 months being honorable when he should have been possessive. On the morning of this 4th day, Caedric stood in the courtyard dressed for travel in dark riding clothes with his left arm still bound tight against his ribs. His horse stamped impatiently while servants loaded minimal supplies. Captain Varon would accompany him with a small guard unit because traveling alone through territory that had been at war days ago was suicidal even for the Duke of Blackthorn. Garrett approached with obvious reluctance, written across his weathered features. "I still think this is insane, Your Grace." "Noted." Caedric's voice remained steady despite the pain radiating through every nerve. "Anything else?" "Just this. If Lady Serafina is half as intelligent as you believe, she's going to see the blood on your hands from this war. She's going to know exactly what kind of violence you're capable of when threatened." Garrett paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Make sure she understands that ruthlessness isn't all you are, that the man who fought like something possessed these past weeks did it partially because he needed to clear obstacles between himself and a future that actually mattered." Caedric absorbed this wisdom from someone who'd known him since childhood. "And if she decides the monster is all she can see, then you'll return here and continue ruling through fear like every raven shade before you." Garrett's expression softened fractionally. "But at least you'll know you tried. That counts for something." They clasped forearms in the old military fashion. Then Caedric mounted his horse with gritted teeth and controlled movements that disguised just how close to collapse he actually was. The gates of Blackthorn Keep opened, and the Duke rode south toward the capital with blood still seeping through his bandages and a certainty burning in. His chest that this was either going to save him or destroy whatever remained human beneath the ruthless exterior. Either way, he was done hiding from what he wanted. The capital city of Valamont appeared on the horizon at sunset 3 days later. Caedric had pushed the pace harder than anyone thought possible, given his injuries. He'd reopened the shoulder wound twice and was fairly certain at least 2 ribs had cracked further during the journey. But he'd made it, which was all that mattered. They entered through the northern gate just as lamplighters began their evening rounds. The city looked the same as it always did, bustling with merchants and nobles and common folk going about their lives, completely unaware that the man riding past them had just crushed a rebellion with overwhelming brutality. Caedric headed directly for the Vale family estate on the eastern edge of the noble district. It was a beautiful property surrounded by gardens that looked particularly striking in the fading light. He'd attended exactly 1 formal dinner here during the courtship with Eveline, maintaining perfect politeness while trying not to stare at Serafina standing quietly near the windows. That seemed like a lifetime ago now. He dismounted in front of the main entrance with movements that probably looked graceful from a distance but felt like dying up close. Varon moved to help, but Caedric waved him off. This part he needed to do alone even if it killed him. The butler who answered the door took one look at the Duke of Blackthorn standing on the threshold covered in road dust with barely concealed bloodstains on his clothing and went pale. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting—" "I need to see Lord Vale, immediately." "Of course, Your Grace. If you'll wait in the receiving room. Now." The single word carried enough weight to make the butler step aside automatically. Caedric walked into the estate's grand foyer on sheer willpower and stubbornness. Every step felt like grinding broken glass into his ribs. His shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat. But he remained upright through discipline and the knowledge that collapsing now would undermine everything he was trying to accomplish. Lord Richard Vale appeared within minutes, his expression cycling rapidly through surprise, concern, and carefully concealed fear. He was a cautious man in his 60s who'd survived noble politics by never taking sides too publicly. Having the Duke of Blackthorn show up unannounced at his door days after crushing a rebellion probably ranked among his worst nightmares. "Your Grace." He bowed stiffly. "This is unexpected. To what do we owe the honor?" Caedric didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I'm here to request permission to court your daughter." Silence fell like a physical weight. Lord Vale stared at him as if he'd just grown a second head. Somewhere deeper in the house, servants stopped moving to listen. "Court Evelyn!" Richard's voice came out strangled. "Your Grace, she's engaged to Lord Greymont. The wedding is, not Evelyn." Cadric cut him off with surgical precision. "Seraphina. I'm here to formally request permission to court Lady Seraphina Vale." The silence that followed was so absolute Cadric could hear his own blood rushing in his ears. Lord Vale's face went through several expressions before settling on absolute confusion. "I don't understand, Your Grace. She's not—" He struggled to find words that wouldn't offend. "She's my younger daughter, quiet, bookish, not the type nobles typically pursue for advantageous matches. I'm not interested in advantageous matches." Cadric's voice remained steady despite exhaustion and pain. Cadric's voice remained. "I'm interested in your daughter. The woman I should have chosen 3 months ago before honor and propriety convinced me to respect a sacrifice neither of us wanted." Yeah. Richard stared at him for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Completely. Your Grace, with all respect, you just finished crushing a rebellion. Half the kingdom is terrified of you right now. And you're standing in my foyer asking to court my younger daughter, who society barely notices." "Yes. No hesitation, no doubt. May I ask why?" "But—" Cadric met the older man's gaze with the kind of brutal honesty that felt like tearing open a wound. "Because she's the only person who ever looked at me and saw past the title and terror to whatever remains human underneath. Because 3 months of trying to forget her has only made me more certain that I'd rather burn the entire kingdom down than spend the rest of my life pretending I don't feel this way. Because I'm done being rational when rationality means dying slowly from the inside." Lord Vale absorbed this confession in stunned silence. Finally, he nodded once. "She's in the library, third door on the left. But Your Grace, if you hurt my daughter the way you hurt those rebels, Duke or not, you'll answer to me." Cadric's smile held genuine respect. "Fair enough. He walked through the estate, following directions toward the library with his heart hammering against his damaged ribs. This was it. The moment 3 months of war and violence and brutal decision-making had been building toward. Either Seraphina would understand why he'd come, or he'd return to Blackthorn alone and continue ruling through fear for the rest of his life. The library door stood slightly ajar. Candlelight spilled into the hallway. Cadric pushed it open slowly and stepped inside. Seraphina sat in a chair near the window with a book forgotten in her lap. She wore a simple dark blue dress. Her hair was pulled back loosely. And when she looked up at the sound of the door opening, her dark eyes went wide with shock. For several heartbeats, neither of them moved. They just stared at each other across the candlelit library, like two people who'd spent months pretending they could survive without this exact moment. Then Seraphina stood slowly, the book sliding from her lap to land on the floor with a soft thud neither of them acknowledged. "Cadric," his name came out barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" He closed the door behind him with deliberate care. "I came to tell you something I should have said 3 months ago before you stepped between me and what I wanted." I don't understand." "Yes, you do." He moved closer, each step carefully controlled despite the pain radiating through his entire body. "You understood the night of the Ascension Ball when you guided me toward your sister with that devastating smile, when you sacrificed your own heart to protect Evelyn's reputation and your family's standing." Seraphina's breath caught audibly. "You were supposed to marry her. Society expected— Society can go to hell." The words came out harsh and unfinished. "I spent 3 months trying to respect your decision, trying to be honorable and controlled and everything a duke is supposed to be when a woman makes it clear she's choosing her family over him." "Cadric, let me finish." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough now that she could probably see the blood staining his shirt beneath the travel coat. "Then I'll leave if that's what you want. But you need to hear this first." She nodded shakily, her hands twisted together in front of her. "I just spent the last 2 weeks crushing a rebellion with violence brutal enough that nobles will whisper about it for generations. I killed men personally. I took a fortress by force through sheer refusal to accept any outcome except total victory. And I did it partially because ambitious houses needed reminding that scandal doesn't make me weak." He paused, making certain she understood every word. But I also did it because ending that war quickly was the only way I could ride here without worrying about assassins striking while I was gone. Because every enemy I killed was one less obstacle between me and the woman I've spent 3 months trying unsuccessfully to forget. Serafina's eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. I thought I was doing the right thing, protecting Evelyn, protecting our family from scandal. Bochkis. Botsing. I know. His voice softened fractionally, and I respected that decision even though it nearly killed me watching you walk away. But Evelyn came to Blackthorn before the war started. She released us both from whatever obligation we thought we owed her, and she told me you've been disappearing into yourself ever since that night, refusing marriage proposals, barely eating, becoming a ghost in your own house. She had no right. She had every right. Kedrick lifted his hand slowly, giving Serafina time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't move, he traced the line of her jaw with careful reverence. Because she understood something I was too stubborn to accept. That you weren't sacrificing yourself to protect her. You were sacrificing yourself because you believed I deserved someone better than a younger daughter society barely notices. A tear finally escaped, tracking down Serafina's cheek. You deserve a duchess who can stand beside you at court without being invisible. I don't want a duchess who performs for court. His thumb brushed away the tear with infinite gentleness. I want the woman who stood in forgotten libraries and listened to me admit that ruling through fear is exhausting. Who showed compassion to orphans while nobles performed charity only for applause. Who looked at the violence simmering beneath my control and didn't turn away in horror. Kedrick, I'm not strong enough for what you're describing. You're stronger than anyone I've ever met. The certainty in his voice allowed no argument. You survived growing up invisible in a world that only values beauty and bloodlines. You sacrificed your own happiness to protect your sister, and you did it all without losing the kindness that makes you fundamentally different from every other person I've been forced to interact with. Serafina shook her head slowly, but her hand came up to cover his where it still rested against her face. The things you've done, the violence, the brutality. How can you want someone like me because you're the only thing that makes the violence worth surviving? The confession came out raw and unfinished. Because I can rule through fear and make brutal decisions and do everything necessary to maintain order. But it only feels bearable when I imagine coming home to someone who sees past all of that to whatever remains human underneath. Mools. He leaned forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. I'm done being honorable when honor means slowly dying inside. I'm done respecting a sacrifice neither of us wanted. So I'm asking you directly, Serafina Vale. Will you let me court you properly this time? Will you give me a chance to prove that the ruthless duke everyone fears is capable of something beyond violence and political calculation? For a moment that stretched into eternity, she just stared at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had haunted him for 3 months. Then finally she spoke. Yes. The single word hit Kedrick with more force than any blade he'd faced during combat. Relief and something far more dangerous flooded through him in equal measure. Yes? He needed to hear it again. Needed confirmation this wasn't exhaustion-induced hallucination. Yes. Serafina's smile broke through tears like sunlight through storm clouds. On one condition. Anything. You let me help you to a chair before you collapse from whatever injuries you're clearly hiding right now. He laughed despite the pain radiating through his ribs. Deal. Despite the pain. She guided him to the nearest chair with careful hands that noticed everything. How he favored his left side. The way he moved like someone barely holding together through discipline alone. When he finally sat with a barely suppressed groan, Serafina knelt beside the chair and started unbuttoning his coat with gentle insistence. You're bleeding through your bandages. I reopened the shoulder wound riding here. It's fine. It's not fine. Her voice held unexpected steel. You nearly killed yourself ending that rebellion and then rode here immediately instead of recovering properly. I had priorities. She looked up at him with an expression caught between exasperation and something far softer. I'm your priority. You're the only thing that matters. No hesitation, complete certainty. Seraphina's hand stilled against his chest. Cedric Ravenshade, you are the most ruthless, stubborn, impossible man I've ever met. And you love me anyway. It wasn't a question. Just a statement of fact delivered with the same confidence he brought to tactical decisions and military strategy. Seraphina's breath caught, but she didn't deny it. Yes, she whispered finally. I love you anyway. He pulled her up into his lap, despite the explosion of pain from his damaged ribs, kneading her close enough to confirm this was actually happening. She settled carefully against him, mindful of his injuries, her head tucked beneath his chin. I'm not an easy man to love, Cedric said quietly. The violence isn't going to disappear just because I have someone worth coming home to. The ruthlessness will still be necessary. The brutal decisions will still need making. I know. Her hand rested over his heart, feeling it beat steady and strong despite everything. But maybe you don't have to carry all of that alone anymore. Maybe that's what I'm for. To remind you that the monster isn't all you are when the darkness starts feeling like the only thing left. He closed his eyes against the overwhelming relief of finally being seen and accepted for exactly what he was. Monster and man together, ruthless and tender, capable of violence and desperate for connection. I'm going to marry you, he said into her hair. Not asking, stating a future he intended to claim with the same certainty he'd brought to ending the rebellion. Soon, before anyone can find another reason why we shouldn't. Seraphina tilted her head back to meet his gaze directly. That sounds like an order, Your Grace. It is. Her smile could have stopped his heart. Then I suppose I'll have to obey. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped together in the candlelit library while the rest of the estate pretended not to notice the Duke of. Blackthorn had claimed their youngest daughter in a way that would reshape noble politics for generations. And for the first time in 3 months, Cedric felt something besides exhaustion and controlled violence. He felt hope. The engagement announcement came 3 days after Cedric's arrival at the capital, delivered through formal channels that made it impossible for noble houses to claim ignorance or challenge the union through political maneuvering. Duke Cedric Ravenshade of Blackthorn Keep was officially courting Lady Seraphina Vale, with her father's blessing and the explicit approval of Lady Evelyn herself, who sent a letter so gracious and supportive that even the most cynical courtiers couldn't twist it into scandal. Society reacted exactly as expected. Shock rippled through drawing rooms and council chambers. Nobles who'd spent months whispering about the Duke's compromised judgment now found themselves forced to accept that the most powerful ruler in the North had chosen a woman they'd barely noticed existed. Some called it romantic. Others called it madness. But no one dared challenge it openly, not after what had happened to the rebels who'd mistaken scandal for weakness. Cedric spent those first days recovering from injuries that should have killed him during the siege. The arrow wound in his shoulder required constant attention from physicians who looked increasingly concerned every time they changed his bandages. His ribs needed another week of immobilization before he could move without grinding broken bone against damaged tissue. But he refused to return to Blackthorn until the engagement was formalized through every proper channel, which meant enduring the capital's oppressive social rituals while healing. Seraphina visited him daily at the townhouse he'd commandeered for his stay. She brought books and sat reading aloud while he recovered, her voice turning stories into something that made the pain bearable. Sometimes they talked for hours about everything and nothing, politics and philosophy, and the small observations about human nature that revealed how carefully she'd been watching the world while everyone assumed she wasn't paying attention. He learned that she preferred thunderstorms to sunshine because the sound of rain helped her think, that she'd memorized the layouts of every major library in the capital after years of escaping society gatherings to hide among books, that she had opinions about military strategy gleaned from reading historical accounts that would put half his advisors to shame. And Cedric found himself falling deeper into something that felt simultaneously like salvation and surrender. This wasn't the controlled possession he'd expected when he rode here determined to claim what he wanted. This was messier, more complicated, the kind of connection that required vulnerability he hadn't accessed since childhood. She saw through every defense he tried maintaining. When he attempted falling back into the cold Duke persona that kept everyone at safe distance, Seraphina just looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes, until he dropped the mask and spoke honestly. When nightmares from the siege woke him gasping, she sat beside him in the darkness and didn't ask questions he couldn't answer yet. It was terrifying in ways combat had never been, because losing her now would destroy something fundamental that he'd only just discovered existed beneath the ruthlessness and controlled violence. On the seventh night, he woke from fever dreams to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed, a book fallen open across her lap. Moonlight painted her features in silver and shadow. She looked peaceful in a way she never did during waking hours when society's judgment pressed down on both of them. Kaedric watched her breathing slowly, feeling something crack open in his chest that had nothing to do with damaged ribs. This was what he'd fought for during the rebellion. This quiet moment of peace with someone who understood the darkness and chose to stay anyway. Not because she was weak or naive, but because she possessed strength of a different kind. The kind that looked at broken things and saw worth saving. He was still watching her when she stirred awake, disoriented briefly before her eyes focused on his face. "You should be sleeping," she said softly. "So should you." Serafina smiled with exhaustion and affection tangled together. "Someone needs to make sure you don't try getting up before the physicians clear you for movement. I'm fine. You're a terrible liar when it comes to physical pain." Her hand found his where it rested on the blanket, fingers intertwining naturally. "How are you really?" Kaedric considered the question with the honesty she'd somehow earned through sheer persistence. "Terrified that I'll wake up and discover this was fever-induced hallucination. That you'll change your mind once society starts treating you differently for choosing me." "I'm not going to change my mind. You say that now. But being the Duchess of Blackthorn means enduring scrutiny and judgment from people who've spent their entire lives perfecting cruelty disguised as politeness. It means living in a fortress on the edge of the kingdom while I make brutal decisions that will haunt you during quiet moments." Serafina sat forward, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Kaedric, I've spent my entire life being invisible. I've watched society destroy people through whispers and calculated exclusion. I know exactly what choosing you means, and I'm choosing it anyway because being invisible beside you is still better than being visible with anyone else." The simplicity of that truth hit him harder than any wound he'd taken during combat. He lifted their joined hands and pressed his lips against her knuckles with reverence that felt dangerously close to worship. "I love you." The words came out raw and unfinished, but they were true in ways nothing else had been for years. "I don't know if that makes this better or worse, but you should know." Her breath caught audibly. "You've never said that before. I've never felt it before. Not like this. Not in a way that makes everything else seem meaningless if I lose it." Serafina's free hand came up to trace the scar on his cheek with infinite gentleness. "You're not going to lose it. You're stuck with me now, Your Grace. For better or worse." "Mostly worse," he said with dark humor. "I'll take my chances." They stayed like that until dawn began painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Kaedric allowed himself to believe that maybe, finally, something in his life would work out exactly as he needed it to. He should have known better. The poison came during a formal dinner hosted by Lord Chancellor Hadrian to celebrate the engagement. It was a massive affair attended by every important noble house in the capital, designed to demonstrate unified support for the Duke's controversial choice. Kaedric attended despite his physician's protests, because showing weakness now would undermine everything he'd fought to establish. He sat at the head table with Serafina beside him, wearing a gown of deep emerald that made her look like someone who belonged in positions of power despite society's previous assessment. Lord Vale sat to her other side, clearly still processing that his youngest daughter had somehow captured the attention of the kingdom's most dangerous ruler. Evelyn and her new fiancé, Lord Greymont, occupied seats nearby, both looking genuinely happy for the couple everyone else was still trying to understand. The meal progressed through 7 courses with appropriate speeches and toasts. Nobles who'd been whispering about madness and obsession 3 weeks ago now offered congratulations with carefully practiced sincerity. Kaedric played his role perfectly. The controlled duke whose recent brutality had reminded everyone why challenging Blackthorn was suicide. But beneath the political theater, something felt wrong. A tension in the air that he couldn't quite identify through layers of pain medication and forced sociability. He'd learned to trust his instincts during years of navigating court politics and 3 border wars that could have ended very differently without constant vigilance. The sensation intensified during the sixth course when servants brought wine from the Chancellor's private collection. Something about the way one particular server moved caught Kaedric's attention. Too careful, too deliberate, the kind of controlled precision that came from intense focus rather than practiced routine. He watched the man pour wine into crystal glasses with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. The tremor was barely noticeable unless you'd spent years learning to read body language for signs of deception and threat. Kaedric's combat instinct screamed warning, even though his rational mind couldn't immediately identify the specific danger. The servant reached Seraphina's glass. Everything inside Kaedric went absolutely still. He'd survived assassination attempts before through combination of luck and hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia. That same instinct fired now with overwhelming certainty that something was catastrophically wrong with this situation. "Don't drink that," he said quietly. "Damn." His hand shooting out to cover Seraphina's glass before she could lift it. She looked at him in confusion. "What's wrong?" "The wine." He kept his voice low enough that only she could hear, while his eyes tracked the servant who'd already moved down the table. "Something's wrong with it. You're imagining things because you're still recovering." Seraphina's tone held gentle concern rather than belief. The physician said paranoia can be a side effect of... "I'm not paranoid." Kaedric's grip tightened fractionally on her wrist. "Trust me on this, Seraphina. Don't drink anything from that bottle." Around them, other guests were raising glasses in preparation for another toast. Lord Chancellor Hadrian stood at the center of the head table with his own wine lifted high, preparing to deliver remarks about unity and tradition and the strength of noble alliances properly maintained. Kaedric's mind raced through possibilities with tactical speed. If the wine was poisoned, who was the target? Him specifically, which made sense given recent events. Or Seraphina, which would destroy him more effectively than any blade. Or possibly everyone at the head table in some kind of mass political assassination disguised as celebration. The Chancellor began speaking, his voice carrying through the hall with practiced authority. "To Duke Ravenshade and Lady Seraphina, whose union represents..." Kaedric stood abruptly, the motion sending pain shooting through his still-healing ribs. "Don't drink the wine." Silence crashed through the dining hall like a physical force. 200 nobles froze mid-motion, glasses halfway to lips, expressions cycling rapidly through confusion toward concern as they registered the Duke's tone. Lord Chancellor Hadrian's smile faltered. "Your Grace, I assure you our wine selection is..." "Where is the servant who poured the sixth course?" Kaedric's voice cut through attempted explanation with surgical precision, "the one who came from the eastern entrance approximately 4 minutes ago." The Chancellor looked genuinely baffled now. "I'm not certain which servant you mean, Your Grace. Our staff, find him. Now." This wasn't a request. This was a command delivered with absolute authority that made even the highest-ranking nobles shift uncomfortably. Captain Veron, who'd been stationed near the side entrance throughout dinner, moved immediately. His soldiers fanned out through the hall with weapons drawn, searching for someone who'd probably disappeared the moment Kaedric called attention to the wine. "Your Grace," Lord Vale spoke carefully from Seraphina's other side. "Perhaps we should test the wine first." Kaedric gestured toward his own untouched glass. "Bring it to your best physician and have them analyze it immediately. If I'm wrong, I'll apologize publicly for disrupting the celebration. If I'm right, we have a much larger problem." The tension in the hall ratcheted up several notches. Nobles began whispering urgently among themselves. Some discreetly pushed their wine glasses away from their plates. Others looked to the Chancellor for guidance on how to respond to accusations being made without evidence. Hadrian's expression had gone carefully neutral in a way that made Kaedric's instincts scream louder. The man was too controlled, too measured in his response when genuine confusion should have produced visible frustration or concern. "Of course, Your Grace," the Chancellor gestured to a servant hovering nearby. "Take Duke Ravenshade's wine to Master Physician Aldrin immediately for analysis." But as the servant moved to comply, Kaedric noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The smallest flicker of eye contact between Hadrian and someone seated 3 tables away. A council member named Lord Petros who'd voted against military funding during the border conflicts, who'd been quietly vocal about the Duke's compromised judgment after the Winter Ascension Ball scandal. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But Kaedric had survived decades of politics by trusting pattern recognition even when evidence remained circumstantial. He reached out and took Serafina's hand beneath the table, squeezing once in silent communication that something very dangerous was unfolding. She squeezed back, her expression calm despite the chaos erupting around them. That steady trust in his judgment, even without explanation, felt simultaneously comforting and terrifying because it meant she was tied to his fate completely now. Captain Veron returned 15 minutes later with grim features. "Your Grace, the servant has vanished. We found his uniform discarded in a storage room near the kitchens. No other witnesses. No trail." The hall erupted in alarmed conversation. Nobles who'd been skeptical moments ago now looked genuinely frightened, because an assassin disappearing during a formal dinner meant security had been compromised at the highest levels, meant someone with significant resources and inside knowledge had orchestrated an attempt on the Duke's life during what should have been the safest possible environment. Kedrick remained absolutely still, his mind working through implications faster than anyone else could follow. This wasn't random, wasn't spontaneous. Someone had planned this carefully, timing it for maximum impact when he was still recovering from siege wounds and distracted by engagement celebrations. The physician arrived 20 minutes later, his face pale beneath his gray beard. "Your Grace, the wine contains wolfsbane, enough in a single glass to kill within an hour. More than enough to ensure no antidote would work fast enough to save anyone who drank it." Pandemonium. Nobles stood and began shouting questions and accusations. Guards flooded the hall, and through it all Kedrick stood perfectly motionless, tracking every reaction with predatory focus, while his tactical mind assembled pieces of a puzzle he desperately didn't want to complete. Because wolfsbane wasn't easy to acquire, wasn't something random assassins carried. It required connections and resources that suggested noble involvement at high levels, and the timing was too perfect, too calculated to be anything except an inside conspiracy designed to eliminate him before his marriage to Serafina could produce heirs that would secure Blackthorn's succession. He looked at Lord Chancellor Hadrian and saw the smallest crack in the man's carefully maintained composure, saw the way his eyes tracked toward Lord Petros before catching himself, saw the calculation happening behind a mask that had probably been in place for years while waiting for the right opportunity to strike. This wasn't just assassination. This was coup disguised as celebration. "How many were involved?" he said quietly, his voice cutting through chaos like a blade. "How many council members were part of this, Hadrian?" The Chancellor's expression froze completely. "Your Grace, I don't know what you're implying, but don't." Kedrick stepped forward with controlled movements that disguised just how close to violence he actually was. "Don't insult my intelligence by pretending confusion when you've already given yourself away." The eye contact with Petros, the lack of surprise when I called attention to the wine, the fact that you specifically requested I attend tonight despite knowing I should still be recovering. Around them, realization began dawning across the faces of nobles who'd been paying attention. Lord Vale moved subtly to position himself between Serafina and any potential threat. Eveline had gone pale, her hand gripping Lord Greymont's arm tight enough that her knuckles showed white. "You're making serious accusations without evidence," Hadrian said carefully. "I'm making observations based on decades of surviving people who smile while planning murder." Kedrick's tone remained absolutely level. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell me exactly who else was involved in this attempt. Every council member, every noble house, every person who thought my distraction made me vulnerable enough to eliminate. And if I refuse, then I'll have Captain Veron start executing prisoners until someone talks, starting with Lord Petros, since he's already demonstrated involvement through body language alone." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Nobles backed away from the head table instinctively, creating space for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. Veron's hand rested on his sword hilt with the easy confidence of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate if ordered. For a long moment, Hadrian said nothing. Then his carefully constructed mask finally shattered into something bitter and resentful that had probably been festering beneath the surface for years. "You were supposed to die during the rebellion," he said coldly. "Fenwick and the others were supposed to overwhelm Blackthorn through superior numbers. But you fought like something possessed and crushed them so brutally that the entire plan collapsed. So this was contingency." Kedrick's voice remained steady despite rage building beneath his ribs. "Murder me at my own engagement celebration when I'd be distracted and still recovering from wounds that should have killed me already. Not murder, Your Grace. Justice." Hadrian's composure had fractured completely now, revealing decades of accumulated resentment. "You've ruled through fear and violence for 15 years. You've made decisions that benefited the North while strangling economic growth in southern territories. And then you publicly humiliated one of the kingdom's premier families by refusing Evelyn Vale in front of the entire court because you were obsessed with her invisible younger sister. So this is about wounded pride and economic policy. The contempt in Cadrick's tone could have stripped paint. You're attempting regicide because I didn't marry who you wanted and prioritized military strength over merchant profits. We're attempting to save Valamont from a ruler whose judgment has been compromised. Hadrian gestured toward Serafina with barely concealed disdain. Look at her, Your Grace. She's a bookish girl who society ignored for good reason. She has no political connections worth maintaining, no beauty that would secure alliances, no skills except hiding in libraries and pretending not to exist. And you're willing to risk everything you've built for what? Love? The word came out like an accusation, like something shameful that weakened rather than strengthened. And in that moment, Cedric understood exactly how fundamental the divide actually was between himself and people like Hadrian, who viewed human connection as nothing except transactional value to be leveraged for political gain. You're absolutely right, he said quietly, and every person in the hall leaned forward to hear what came next. I'm willing to risk everything for her, because she's the only person in this entire kingdom who looks at the monster you all fear and sees something worth saving underneath. Because power and territory and legacy mean absolutely nothing if I spend my entire life ruling through fear while dying slowly inside from isolation. He moved closer to Hadrian with controlled precision, each step carefully measured despite the pain radiating through his still healing injuries. But you made one critical miscalculation in your attempt to remove me, Chancellor. You targeted the wine intended for Serafina as well as mine, which means this wasn't just about eliminating a compromised ruler. This was about destroying the one thing I care about more than the throne, and that changes everything. The temperature in the hall seemed to drop several degrees. Nobles who understood the implications began moving toward exits with increasing urgency, because they'd just witnessed the Duke of Blackthorn admit publicly that his attachment to Serafina was the lever ambitious people would use to manipulate or destroy him. And more importantly, they'd seen him acknowledge that vulnerability and decide it was worth defending through whatever violence proved necessary. Captain Varon, Ceadric said without looking away from Hadrian, arrest the Chancellor and bring me Lord Petros and anyone else who makes the mistake of trying to leave before I've finished extracting names. This is madness, Hadrian protested, even as guards moved to restrain him. You can't arrest a sitting Chancellor without council approval. There are protocols, legal protections. You tried to poison me and the woman I loved during a celebration meant to demonstrate unity. Cadric's smile belonged to something far more dangerous than any human expression should contain. Protocols and legal protections died the moment you decided political disagreement justified murder. Now you get to face the consequences of that decision personally. Over the next 6 hours, Blackthorn soldiers methodically extracted confessions from 17 conspirators, including 5 council members and 3 minor noble houses who'd been promised territorial concessions once Cadric was eliminated. The interrogations weren't gentle. Varon employed techniques that would haunt the survivors for years. But by dawn, they had a complete picture of a conspiracy that stretched back 18 months to the first whispers about the Duke's compromised judgment. Ceadric sat in a commandeered council chamber reviewing reports, while exhaustion and pain medication warred for control of his consciousness. His shoulder wound had reopened during the confrontation with Hadrian, blood seeping through fresh bandages in a way that suggested he'd pushed recovery further than his body could actually sustain. But stopping now was impossible when the full scope of the threat still needed addressing. Serafina entered without knocking, carrying tea she probably knew he wouldn't drink, but offered anyway. She looked exhausted in the gray morning light, still wearing the emerald gown from dinner with new creases that spoke to hours spent sitting in uncomfortable chairs while violence unfolded around her. You should be resting, she said quietly. So should you. One of us has to be practical. She set the tea down and moved behind his chair, her hands finding the tight muscles in his shoulders with gentle pressure that made him realize how much tension he'd been carrying. What happens now? Now I execute every conspirator publicly so that no one else gets ideas about testing my resolve. His voice remained flat, emotionless. Then I reorganize the council completely and spend the next 6 months rooting out anyone else who thinks political assassination is acceptable problem solving. Her hands stilled for a moment. You're going to kill 17 people. Yes. Without trial or formal judgment, they confessed. Multiple times, The evidence is overwhelming. Kedrick turned slightly to look up at her. You're disturbed by this. Serafina met his gaze directly without flinching. I'm disturbed that someone tried to kill us during what should have been a celebration. I'm disturbed by how many people were involved in the conspiracy. But I'm not disturbed that you're doing what's necessary to ensure this doesn't happen again. The distinction mattered more than it probably should have. Kedrick reached up to cover her hand where it rested on his shoulder, threading their fingers together with careful deliberation. This is what being with me means, he said quietly. Brutal decisions and public executions, and the knowledge that people will always target you as leverage against me. If you want to walk away now before the marriage makes this permanent, I'll understand. I'll release you from the engagement and make certain society doesn't punish you for my choices. For a long moment, Serafina said nothing. Then she leaned down until her lips brushed against his ear, her voice steady despite everything that had happened. I already told you I'm not changing my mind. The fact that someone tried to poison us just reinforces why we need each other. You need someone who understands the darkness and doesn't turn away. I need someone who will burn kingdoms to keep me safe. That seems like a fair trade. Despite exhaustion and pain and the brutal reality of 17 executions that would need carrying out come morning, Kedrick felt something close to hope. This woman who'd spent her life being invisible had somehow found the strength to stand beside him, even when that position put her directly in danger. Had chosen him knowing exactly what that choice would cost. The executions happened at noon in the city's main square before a crowd of thousands. Kedrick delivered judgment personally, his voice carrying through the square with cold precision as he listed each conspirator's crimes in detail. Lord Chancellor Hadrian died first, his final words a curse against the Duke, who'd refused to rule the way tradition demanded. Lord Petros followed, then the others in succession. The entire kingdom watched as the Duke of Blackthorn demonstrated exactly what happened to people who mistook his recent softness for actual weakness, who thought targeting his emotional attachments was viable strategy, who forgot that beneath the formal coats and political maneuvering lived a man perfectly willing to execute 17 nobles without hesitation when they threatened what he protected. Serafina stood beside him throughout, her hand steady in his despite the horror unfolding before them. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, just remained present in a way that felt simultaneously like condemnation and acceptance, like she was witnessing exactly who he was at his worst and deciding that person was still worth standing beside. By evening, news of the executions and failed coup had spread through every territory in Valamont, and with it came a message that no one could misinterpret. The Duke of Blackthorn had found something worth protecting through whatever violence proved necessary, and anyone foolish enough to threaten that would face consequences swift, brutal, and absolute. But that night, alone in the townhouse with only Serafina for company, Kedrick finally allowed the mask to crack. She found him sitting in darkness by the window, staring out at a city that feared him more than ever, while he felt more vulnerable than he had since childhood. I killed 17 people today, he said, without looking at her. Not in battle, not in defense of territory, in cold execution because they dared to threaten you. Serafina moved to sit beside him, her presence solid and warm in the darkness. And you think that makes you a monster? It doesn't? It makes you someone willing to protect what matters through whatever means necessary. Her hand found his in the darkness. That's not the same thing as being evil. That's just being someone who understands that power without the willingness to use it is meaningless. They tried to kill you because you make me weak. The confession came out raw and unfinished. Because loving you gives enemies a weapon they've never had before. A lever to manipulate or destroy me that didn't exist when I ruled through fear alone. Then we'll make certain they understand that lever only works once. That targeting me doesn't weaken you, it just makes you more dangerous. She shifted closer until her head rested against his shoulder. We'll survive this together, Kedrick, the same way we'll survive everything else that comes after. Because you're not alone anymore in carrying the weight of ruling through violence. I'm here now. For better or worse? Mostly worse, he said with dark humor that couldn't quite hide the desperate relief beneath it. I already told you, I'll take my chances. They sat like that until dawn began painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. And Kedrick understood with absolute certainty that he'd passed a point of no return. That Serafina had become woven so deeply into his survival that losing her now would destroy something fundamental he hadn't even known existed beneath the ruthlessness. She was both his greatest strength and his most catastrophic weakness. And he would spend every day of whatever remained of his life making certain that weakness never became the thing that got either of them killed. The wedding was scheduled for 3 weeks after the executions, a timeline that horrified traditional courtiers who insisted proper ceremonies required months of planning and political coordination. Ceadric ignored their protests with the same cold dismissal he brought to every obstacle standing between him and what he wanted. The union would happen quickly before anyone else decided assassination attempts were acceptable political strategy. But the executions had consequences that rippled through Valamont like shockwaves from an earthquake. 5 noble houses whose members had died in the main square withdrew from court entirely. The remaining lords, retreating to ancestral estates while plotting revenge, they were too intelligent to voice openly. 3 council seats sat empty pending appointments that would reshape the kingdom's power structure for generations. And beneath the visible political fallout, something darker festered in territories that had spent decades resenting Blackthorn's dominance over northern trade routes and military resources. Captain Veron brought the first credible threat report 4 days before the wedding. He entered Ceadric's study without knocking, his young face grim beneath the perpetual shadows that came from sleeping 3 hours per night while coordinating security for a duke half the kingdom wanted dead. Your Grace, we've intercepted correspondence between Lord Marcus Thorne and Duke Sebastian Montclair. They're planning something for the wedding ceremony. Ceadric looked up from military requisition forms he'd been reviewing with the same focused intensity he brought to every administrative task that kept Blackthorn functioning despite constant threats. His shoulder still ached from the arrow wound that refused healing properly. His ribs protested every deep breath. But pain was just information to be acknowledged and compartmentalized while focusing on immediate problems. Define planning something. Veron placed 3 decoded letters on the desk, his expression dark. They reference a final accounting, settlement of debts owed, and multiple mentions of ensuring the bloodline ends before it can produce heirs. The implications hit Ceadric with brutal clarity. This wasn't about preventing his marriage to Seraphina anymore. This was about eliminating both of them during the ceremony itself, when security would be complicated by hundreds of guests, and traditional protocols that limited how many armed soldiers could position themselves near the actual wedding proceedings. He read through the letters with tactical precision, his mind already assembling contingencies and defensive strategies that would keep Seraphina alive even if it meant his own death. That calculation happened automatically now, the shift from viewing survival as individual achievement to mutual protection. She'd become woven so deeply into his continued existence that threats against her registered as more urgent than dangers aimed directly at himself. It was terrifying in ways combat had never been, because caring about someone more than your own survival gave enemies exactly the kind of leverage that got you killed during moments when rational judgment should override emotional attachment. But Ceadric had passed the point where rational judgment held any authority over decisions involving Seraphina's safety. He'd chosen her knowing this vulnerability would exist, and he would deal with consequences as they emerged rather than retreat into the isolated ruthlessness that had defined his rule before she appeared. That was what happened when you found something worth protecting through whatever violence proved necessary. You accepted that the protection itself would require transformations you couldn't predict or control. You became someone capable of making decisions that would have seemed insane 3 months ago because the alternative was losing the only thing that made ruling bearable. How many are involved? His voice remained absolutely level. At minimum, 12 nobles with military resources. Possibly more we haven't identified yet. Veron's jaw tightened. Your Grace, we should postpone the wedding until we've rooted out everyone involved in this conspiracy. No. The single word carried absolute finality. Veron opened his mouth to argue, saw the expression on his duke's face, and closed it again. Postponing shows weakness, Ceadric continued with cold precision. Tells every ambitious house in Valamont that threats can manipulate my decisions. The wedding happens as scheduled. We simply ensure that anyone foolish enough to attack during the ceremony faces consequences so overwhelming that survivors spend generations regretting the attempt. That's insane, Your Grace. You're still recovering from wounds that should have killed you. Half the nobility wants you dead, and you're planning to stand in a cathedral surrounded by potential assassins while making yourself maximally vulnerable through wedding rituals. Yes. Ceadric's smile belonged to something far more dangerous than any human expression should contain. But I'll also have every loyal soldier I control positioned strategically throughout the building. Veron, I want archers in the upper galleries, swordsmen disguised as servants, exits secured and monitored. Anyone carrying a blade who isn't part of my personal guard gets detained immediately, regardless of noble rank. He stood slowly, moving toward the window where morning light painted the capital in shades of amber and shadow. His reflection looked like something carved from exhaustion and barely restrained violence. And make certain Serafina has protection assigned specifically to her at all times. If this goes badly, I need to know she'll survive even if I don't. Varen absorbed the order with grim understanding. You're planning for your own death. I'm planning for every contingency. There's a difference. Kedrick turned back from the window, his pale gray eyes holding the kind of focused intensity that had won 3 border wars. But if forced to choose between my survival and hers, there's no choice at all. She lives. Everything else is negotiable. The captain nodded once, then departed to begin coordinating security measures that would transform a wedding ceremony into something resembling military fortification. And Kedrick remained alone in the study, staring at decoded letters that threatened the only future he'd allowed himself to imagine in 15 years of ruling through fear and isolation. He thought about Serafina sleeping peacefully in guest chambers 3 floors above, unaware that nobles were plotting to murder her during what should be the safest day of her life. Thought about how she'd looked at him in the darkness after the executions and said she was willing to take her chances despite knowing exactly what being with him would cost. That trust was both gift and burden, because it meant he carried responsibility for protecting someone who'd chosen vulnerability by association with a man half the kingdom hated. Someone who should have remained invisible and safe in society's margins instead of becoming the Duchess of Blackthorn and thereby painting a target on her own back. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any crown or military command, more pressing than territorial defense or political maneuvering, because losing Serafina now would destroy something fundamental that he'd only recently discovered existed beneath the ruthlessness. She was the reason brutality remained bearable instead of consuming him completely. The reminder that underneath tactical calculations and controlled violence lived someone still capable of connection. And he would kill every noble in Valamont before allowing conspirators to take that away through assassination disguised as wedding celebration. 3 days before the ceremony, Serafina found him in the armory personally inspecting weapons that would be distributed to his guard during the wedding. He wore only a shirt and trousers, the formal coats abandoned while working. Bandages still wrapped his torso where ribs continued healing with frustrating slowness. The scar on his cheek stood out starkly in the torchlight. She stood in the doorway, watching him move through sword inspections with mechanical precision, testing balance and sharpness like someone preparing for war rather than marriage. You're planning for the wedding to become a battlefield, she said quietly. Kedrick looked up from examining a longsword blade, unsurprised by her presence. He'd felt her enter the room the way he always seemed to register her proximity now, some fundamental awareness that existed independent of conscious observation. I'm planning for every contingency. There's a difference. That's what Captain Varen said you told him. She moved closer, her expression serious in the flickering light. Which means you're both lying. You're not planning for contingencies. You're expecting an attack. He set the sword down with careful precision, then turned to face her directly. Would you prefer I pretend everything is fine? That ambitious nobles haven't already demonstrated willingness to poison us during formal dinners? I'd prefer you tell me the truth instead of trying to protect me through ignorance. Her voice held unexpected steel. I'm not some delicate thing that needs shielding from reality, Kedrick. If people are planning to kill us during our wedding, I deserve to know so I can help prepare instead of becoming a liability through surprise. For a long moment, he just stared at her. This woman who'd spent her life being invisible had somehow developed the kind of backbone that most trained soldiers struggled to maintain under pressure. She wasn't panicking or demanding he cancel the ceremony for safety. She was asking for information so she could contribute to their mutual survival. That transformation from shadow to partner had happened gradually enough that he'd barely noticed until moments like this when her strength became impossible to ignore. She'd chosen him knowing the dangers, had stood beside him during executions without flinching, had looked at the monster everyone feared and decided that person was worth protecting through whatever came next. You're right, he said finally. You deserve the truth. He explained everything, the intercepted letters, the conspiracy involving at least 12 noble houses, the security measures being implemented, the very real possibility that their wedding would become the site of coordinated assassination attempts, designed to eliminate both of them before they could produce heirs that would secure Blackthorn's succession. Serafina listened without interruption, her expression cycling through shock toward something harder, something that looked almost like fury compressed into diamond-sharp focus. "So they're not even pretending this is about political disagreement anymore," she said when he finished. "This is about destroying your bloodline completely, making certain Blackthorn dies with you." "Yes. And you're still planning to go through with the ceremony. I'm not giving them the satisfaction of changing my plans because they threaten violence." Kadric moved closer until he could see flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "But I'm giving you a choice, Serafina. You can walk away now before the wedding binds you permanently to someone half the kingdom wants dead. I'll make certain society doesn't punish you for my decisions. You'll be free to find someone safer who won't turn your life into a series of assassination attempts and political warfare." She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped forward and took his hands in hers with deliberate firmness. "I'm not walking away. Not because of threats or danger or the very real possibility we might die during our own wedding ceremony." Her voice remained steady despite everything. "Because you're mine now, Kedrick Ravenshade, the same way I'm yours. And I'm not letting ambitious nobles take that away through intimidation." The fierce certainty in her tone hit him harder than any wound he'd taken during combat. This wasn't naive bravery or emotional delusion. This was someone who'd calculated risks and decided the potential future together outweighed the very real dangers standing in their path. "You could die," he said quietly. "Not as abstract possibility, but actual likelihood if the attack happens during the ceremony when you're maximally exposed. So could you." Her hands tightened on his. "But we're still getting married. And anyone foolish enough to attack us is going to learn exactly why threatening what you love is the fastest way to discover just how ruthless you can actually become." Despite exhaustion and pain and fear, he refused to acknowledge openly. Kadric felt something close to hope. This woman who should have remained invisible had somehow transformed into someone capable of facing down death threats with the same calm focus he brought to military strategy. "I love you," he said, the words still feeling strange and new despite having spoken them before. "I need you to know that if this goes badly, if I don't survive the wedding, you're surviving." Her expression held absolute certainty. "Because I'm not ruling Blackthorn alone. I'm not facing decades of political warfare without you. So whatever happens during that ceremony, we're both walking out alive, understand?" He pulled her close despite the protest from his still healing ribs, kneading her solid and real against him. "Yes, Your Grace." She laughed despite the tension, the sound muffled against his chest. "I'm not Your Grace yet. Close enough." They stood like that for a long time while torchlight painted shadows across walls lined with weapons being prepared for the wedding that would either secure their future or become the site of their mutual destruction. The wedding day arrived with clear skies and perfect weather that felt almost mocking given what everyone expected would unfold. Kadric woke at dawn in chambers he'd been using since arriving at the capital, his shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat and his ribs protesting every breath. He'd barely slept, mind cycling through tactical scenarios and contingency plans that would keep Serafina alive even if everything went catastrophically wrong. Captain Varen entered without knocking, already wearing dress uniform with concealed armor beneath the formal coat. His expression held the grim focus of someone preparing for battle rather than celebration. "Status report," Kadric ordered while standing to let servants help him dress. 200 soldiers positioned throughout St. Aurelius Cathedral, archers in the upper galleries, swordsmen at every exit. "We've detained 3 suspicious individuals attempting to enter the building with concealed weapons." Varen's jaw tightened. "Your Grace, intelligence suggests the main attack will come during the ceremony itself, when protocols limit how quickly we can respond to threats." Expected. Kadric remained absolutely still while servants worked on formal attire that would need to conceal the bandages still wrapped around his torso. "How is Lady Serafina's security?" 4 guards assigned exclusively to her protection. Orders to prioritize her survival over all other considerations, including yours. "Good." Kadric caught Varen's gaze in the mirror. "If I go down today, your primary objective shifts immediately to getting Serafina out of that cathedral alive. Everything else becomes secondary." "Understood." The captain hesitated fractionally before nodding. "Understood, Your Grace." The formal preparations took 2 hours. By the time Kadric stood fully dressed in black ceremonial attire with silver threading that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than civilized, The morning had progressed toward the ceremony's scheduled noon start. He studied his reflection with critical assessment, seeing someone who appeared calm and controlled despite the violence churning beneath the surface. This was who he'd become over 15 years of ruling through fear and brutal decision-making. Someone capable of standing in a cathedral surrounded by potential assassins while making wedding vows and simultaneously calculating how to maximize enemy casualties if the attack came during vulnerable moments. The fact that duality no longer felt contradictory told him exactly how far he'd traveled from the idealistic young man who'd inherited Blackthorn believing nobility and strength could coexist without compromise. Now he understood that real power required willingness to become exactly the monster circumstances demanded, while somehow maintaining enough humanity to remember why the protection mattered in the first place. Serafina was that reminder, the reason brutality remained tool rather than identity. And he would stand in that cathedral today and claim her publicly before every noble house in Valamont as explicit declaration that she belonged to him completely, regardless of who objected or threatened violence. The cathedral bells began ringing at 11:30, their deep tones carrying across the capital like a summons that could not be ignored. Caedric departed for St. Aurelius, surrounded by guards who moved with the controlled precision of soldiers expecting combat. The streets were lined with common folk who'd gathered to witness the controversial wedding, their expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Inside the cathedral, 200 nobles already filled the pews in arrangements carefully coordinated by protocol officers who'd spent weeks managing seating disputes. Caedric scanned the crowd with tactical precision as he entered, noting familiar faces and potential threats. Lord Marcus Thorne sat 3 rows back, his expression carefully neutral. Duke Sebastian Montclair occupied a position near the center aisle where movement would be difficult but visibility optimal. Both men watched him with the kind of focused attention that confirmed Varen's intelligence about their involvement in the conspiracy. They were here, waiting, planning to strike during the ceremony when tradition would limit how quickly guards could respond to threats without disrupting sacred rituals. Caedric took his position at the front of the cathedral beside the officiant who would perform the ceremony. His hands remained loose at his sides in a stance that looked relaxed, but allowed instant access to the blade concealed beneath his formal coat. Around him, soldiers disguised as servants moved with careful deliberation into positions that would provide maximum coverage if violence erupted. The organ began playing traditional processional music. Every person in the cathedral turned toward the entrance where Serafina would appear. And Caedric felt his heartbeat accelerate with combination of anticipation and fear that had nothing to do with assassination. Threats and everything to do with the woman about to walk toward him through a building full of people who wanted them both dead. Then she appeared in the cathedral entrance, and everything else ceased to exist. She wore a gown of silver and white that seemed to capture light and transform it into something ethereal. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate braids woven through with pearls. But it was her expression that stopped his breath completely. Not nervous or frightened despite knowing the dangers, just absolutely certain, walking toward him with steady purpose like someone who'd already decided nothing would prevent this union from happening. She moved down the aisle with her father beside her, Lord Vale's expression rigid with the knowledge that he might be delivering his daughter to her death. But Serafina's focus never wavered from Caedric's face. She looked at him with the same understanding she'd shown during quiet conversations in forgotten libraries months ago, seen past the ruthless exterior to whatever remained human underneath. When she reached the altar and Lord Vale placed her hand in Caedric's, the touch sent electricity through his entire body despite layers of formal gloves. Her fingers squeezed his once in silent communication that they were in this together regardless of what came next. The officiant began speaking traditional vows in a voice that echoed through the vaulted cathedral. Caedric barely heard the words. His awareness was split between Serafina standing before him and the tactical situation unfolding in his peripheral vision. Soldiers shifting positions, nobles moving subtly in their seats, the tension building toward something that felt increasingly inevitable. It happened during the exchange of rings. Lord Marcus Thorne stood abruptly, his hand moving toward a concealed weapon with the kind of trained precision that marked him as more dangerous than average nobility. Two other conspirators rose simultaneously from different sections of the cathedral, creating multiple threat vectors designed to overwhelm defensive response. But Caedric had been waiting for exactly this moment, expecting it, planning for it with the same tactical precision he brought to every battlefield engagement. He shoved Serafina backward toward Captain Varen, who was already moving to shield her. His own blade cleared its sheath in a motion so fast it seemed to materialize from nowhere. And before Marcus could complete his draw, Kadric's sword took him through the chest with brutal efficiency that came from 15 years of combat experience. The cathedral erupted into chaos. Soldiers flooded forward from concealed positions. Archers in the upper galleries released arrows with deadly precision toward identified conspirators. Nobles screamed and scrambled for exits while violence exploded through the sacred space with overwhelming intensity. Kadric killed 3 more men within seconds. His movements fluid, despite injuries that should have slowed him. Pain was just information. Fear was just distraction. The only thing that mattered was eliminating threats before they could reach Serafina, who Varen had pinned against a side wall with his own body serving as shield. Duke Sebastian Montclair made it within 10 feet of her position before Kadric intercepted him with a tackle that sent both men crashing into the stone floor. They rolled across marble slick with blood while struggling for dominance. Sebastian was younger, stronger, without the arrow wound and broken ribs that compromised Kadric's movements. But Kadric fought with the desperate fury of someone protecting the only thing that made survival worthwhile. He drove his blade through Sebastian's throat with savage precision, then shoved the dying Duke aside and surged back to his feet. Blood covered his formal attire. His shoulder wound had reopened completely, crimson spreading through silver threading. But he remained upright through pure determination and the knowledge that collapsing now meant Serafina's death. The fighting continued for another brutal 3 minutes before Blackthorn soldiers established complete control. Bodies littered the cathedral floor. Wounded nobles groaned while physicians rushed to provide aid. And through it all, Kadric stood bleeding and swaying slightly but still conscious, his pale gray eyes scanning for any remaining threats with predatory focus. "Your Grace," Varen's voice cut through the chaos. "It's over. We've neutralized all identified conspirators." Kadric nodded once, then his legs gave out completely. He went down hard onto the blood-slicked marble, his body finally surrendering to blood loss and injuries pushed far beyond sustainable limits. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Serafina breaking free from her guards and rushing toward him with an expression of absolute terror. Then nothing. Bounce. He woke in familiar surroundings 3 days later. Blackthorn Keep, his own chambers with their northern-facing windows showing the violent sea beyond. Someone had cleaned him up and changed bandages multiple times while he was unconscious. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and his ribs felt like grinding broken glass. But he was alive. That was something. The door opened and Serafina entered carrying tea. She definitely knew he wouldn't drink but offered anyway. When she saw his eyes were open, relief flooded across her features so powerfully it was almost physical. "You're awake." Her voice came out hoarse, like she'd been crying or screaming or both. The physicians weren't certain you'd survive the blood loss. How long was I out? 3 days. She set the tea down and moved to sit beside the bed, her hand finding his with desperate firmness. "You nearly died in that cathedral. Your heart stopped twice during surgery." Kadric absorbed this information with the same calm he brought to tactical reports. "And the conspirators? Dead or imprisoned?" Captain Varen ensured none escaped justice. Her expression hardened. The conspiracy reached deeper than anyone predicted. 17 noble houses were involved in planning the attack. Half the kingdom's southern territories were ready to support a coup once you were eliminated. So we're at war again. We were always at war. Serafina's thumb traced patterns across his knuckles. But now we're married. The ceremony was completed during the fighting before you collapsed, which means I'm officially the Duchess of Blackthorn, and anyone who wants you dead has to go through me first. Despite pain and exhaustion, Kadric felt something close to satisfaction. We got married during an active battle? The officiant decided traditional vows weren't necessary given the circumstances. She smiled with dark humor. He declared us bonded before witnesses and then fled to safety while you were killing Duke Montclair. Very romantic. Kadric laughed despite the agony it sent through his damaged ribs. "I'm sorry our wedding became a bloodbath." "I'm not." Her expression turned serious. "Because now everyone in Valamont understands exactly what happens to people who threaten what you protect. 17 noble houses learned that lesson the hardest way possible." She leaned forward until her forehead rested against his, her breath warm against his skin. "You terrified me," she whispered. When you went down in that cathedral, when the physicians couldn't stop the bleeding, I thought I'd lost you before we even began. I'm still here. Barely. Close enough. They stayed like that while afternoon sunlight painted patterns across stone walls and the northern sea continued its eternal assault on the cliffs below. And Kaedric understood with absolute certainty that he'd survived for a reason. That whatever came next would be faced together with the woman who'd chosen him, knowing exactly what that choice would cost. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Captain Veron's latest intelligence report sat unopened on the desk nearby, probably detailing new threats from territories emboldened by the wedding attack. The southern provinces would need months of brutal suppression before order could be fully restored. But for this moment, none of that mattered. Because he was alive, Serafina was safe, and they were married despite every obstacle society had thrown in their path. The real war was just beginning, and Kaedric Ravenshade had finally found something worth burning the entire kingdom to protect. Recovery took longer than Kaedric wanted to admit, and hurt worse than any wound he'd sustained during 15 years of combat. The arrow injury to his shoulder had become infected during the cathedral fighting, requiring surgeons to reopen the wound and drain tissue that had begun rotting from the inside. His ribs needed another month of immobilization, and the blood loss had left him weak in ways that made simple tasks like standing or walking feel like climbing mountains. But the physical damage was nothing compared to the political wreckage left behind after the wedding attack. 17 noble houses had been implicated in the conspiracy. Their lords were dead or imprisoned. Their lands had been seized by Blackthorn authority, and the power vacuum created by removing so many southern families simultaneously had destabilized the entire kingdom in ways that would take years to fully resolve. Serafina stayed with him through every brutal moment of recovery. She sat beside his bed during fever dreams that made him relive the cathedral fighting in endless violent loops. She changed bandages when physicians weren't available and forced him to eat when pain made the prospect of food unbearable. She read aloud from books during hours when speaking required more energy than he could muster. And slowly, agonizingly, Kaedric began understanding that survival after that kind of violence required more than just physical healing. Required examining what he'd become during decades of ruling through fear and asking whether that version of himself could actually sustain a marriage to someone who deserved better than a husband who solved every problem through brutality. The realization came during a particularly difficult night 2 weeks after waking. He'd been dreaming about the executions in the main square, watching Lord Chancellor Hadrian die again and again while crowds cheered for justice delivered through overwhelming violence. When he jerked awake, gasping, Serafina was already there with a cool cloth and steady presence that made the nightmares bearable. "You were dreaming about the executions again," she said quietly, while pressing the cloth against his fevered forehead. "How did you know?" "Because you always make the same sounds, like you're trying to justify something that doesn't need justification." Her dark eyes held his with uncomfortable perception. "You think the violence makes you a monster, doesn't it?" The question came out hoarse. "I've killed more men than I can count. I executed 17 people publicly. I turned our wedding into a massacre." At what point does necessary brutality cross into something darker? Serafina set the cloth aside and took his hand with deliberate firmness. "You want to know what I think? I think you've spent 15 years becoming exactly what circumstances required to maintain order and protect people who would have been destroyed by weaker rulers. I think you made brutal choices because the alternatives were worse. And I think you're haunted by those decisions precisely because you're not actually a monster, despite how hard you've worked to convince everyone otherwise." The words hit him with unexpected force, because she was right in ways he'd been avoiding acknowledging. The nightmares weren't guilt about the violence itself. They were fear that he'd crossed some invisible line where brutality became identity instead of tool. That he'd lost the ability to distinguish between necessary force and cruelty for its own sake. "I don't know how to be anything except what I've become," he admitted quietly. "Don't know how to rule without fear or make decisions without calculating which option requires the most strategic violence. That's who I am now, Serafina. That's what 15 years of this has created." She shifted closer until her head rested against his shoulder, careful not to aggravate his injuries. "Then we figure it out together. We learn how to maintain order without becoming consumed by the brutality it requires. We find ways to remind each other that the violence is tool rather than identity." Her voice dropped to something barely audible, "because you're not alone in carrying this weight anymore. That's what marriage means. That's what I signed up for when I chose you, knowing exactly what that choice would cost. You get to stop pretending the monster is all you are. You get to be human with me, even when that feels more terrifying than combat. Kadrick closed his eyes against the overwhelming relief of finally being seen completely and accepted anyway. This was what he'd been searching for without realizing it during all those years of isolated ruling. Not someone who feared his ruthlessness or worshipped his power. Someone who acknowledged both aspects and decided the whole complicated reality was worth choosing despite its contradictions. "I love you," he said into her hair. "More than I thought I was capable of loving anything." "I know." She pressed a kiss against his jaw with infinite gentleness. "Now rest. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to rebuild a kingdom that's been destabilized by our survival." The work of stabilization began slowly as Kaedric's physical recovery progressed. Captain Varen brought daily reports about territories requiring direct intervention. Lord Vale helped coordinate political negotiations with noble houses that hadn't been involved in the conspiracy but needed reassurance that Blackthorn wouldn't simply seize all southern lands through force. And Serafina revealed an unexpected talent for administrative coordination that made the entire process more efficient than Kaedric could have managed alone. She transformed from invisible younger daughter into someone capable of navigating complex political situations with the same careful observation she'd always possessed. Nobles who'd ignored her completely 3 months ago now found themselves dealing with a duchess who understood their vulnerabilities and motivations better than they understood themselves. Kaedric watched her work with combination of pride and growing awareness that he'd underestimated just how much strength had been hidden beneath that carefully cultivated invisibility. She wasn't soft or naive or in need of protection the way he'd initially assumed. She was someone who'd survived years of society's dismissal by becoming exceptionally skilled at reading people and adapting strategies accordingly. That realization changed something fundamental in how he approached their partnership. He'd been prepared to protect her through overwhelming violence. Now he understood she didn't need protection so much as space to deploy her own considerable capabilities in ways that complemented his more brutal methods. They developed a pattern over the following weeks. Kaedric handled situations requiring military force or explicit threats. Serafina managed political negotiations and the kind of subtle manipulation that avoided violence through strategic conversation. Together, they addressed problems that would have overwhelmed either of them individually. But the real transformation happened during quiet evenings when official business was finished, and they were alone in chambers overlooking the northern sea. Those moments forced Kaedric to practice being human rather than Duke, to acknowledge fears and uncertainties he'd spent 15 years suppressing because rulers couldn't afford visible weakness. One night, approximately 6 weeks after the cathedral attack, Serafina found him standing at the window, staring into darkness, with an expression she'd learned meant he was wrestling with something too large to articulate easily. "Talk to me," she said softly from the doorway. Kaedric didn't turn around. His reflection in the glass looked gaunt, worn down by recovery and the weight of decisions that continued accumulating. "I've been thinking about my father, about the man he became after decades of ruling through fear and isolation." "What about him?" "He died alone in the war room, surrounded by advisors who smiled while counting days until his funeral. He built an empire through ruthless efficiency and maintained order through overwhelming force. And at the end, he had nothing except legacy and the knowledge that his son would inherit the same burden of becoming exactly what circumstances required, regardless of personal cost." Kedric's hands curled into fists against the window frame. "I used to think that was strength, that sacrificing everything personal for duty represented the highest form of leadership. But now I'm married to someone who sees past the masks I wear, and I'm terrified of becoming him anyway. Of slowly transforming into a man who rules brilliantly but dies hollow, with nothing except power to show for 50 years of calculated brutality." Serafina moved to stand beside him, her presence solid and warm in the darkness. "You're not going to become your father." "How can you be certain?" "Because he didn't have me." Her hand found his where it rested against the glass. He didn't have someone willing to call him on his cruelty when it crossed from necessary into excessive. He didn't have a partner who understood that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites. He ruled alone by choice because he believed isolation was required for effective leadership. She turned to face him directly, forcing eye contact. "But you're not alone anymore. You have me. And I'm not going to let you disappear into the role the way he did." I'm going to keep reminding you that the Duke of Blackthorn is just one aspect of who you are, not the totality of your existence. That you get to be Kaedric with me even when being human feels more dangerous than staying behind armor permanently. The conviction in her voice broke something open in his chest that had been locked tight since childhood, since watching his father die bitter and isolated despite ruling successfully for 40 years, since inheriting a position that demanded he become someone capable of making decisions that would haunt him during quiet moments. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted quietly. "Don't know how to be both the ruler everyone needs and the husband you deserve. Then we learn together." Seraphina's smile held fierce determination. "We make mistakes and figure out corrections. We establish boundaries between Duke and person. We create space for vulnerability inside a life that mostly requires ruthlessness. And we forgive ourselves when we get the balance wrong, because perfection isn't actually achievable." Kaedric pulled her close despite the lingering ache in his ribs, needing her solid and real against him. This woman who'd been invisible 3 months ago had somehow become the foundation preventing him from collapsing completely under the weight of everything ruling required. Had chosen to stand beside the darkness without being consumed by it herself. That was strength of a different kind than he'd been taught to value. Not the ability to endure isolation, but the courage to remain connected even when connection created vulnerability that enemies would try exploiting. Not ruthlessness maintained through emotional distance, but conscious choice to protect what mattered through whatever means proved necessary, while still preserving the humanity that made the protection worthwhile. He was still learning how to integrate those contradictions, still figuring out how to be the Duke who executed conspirators without hesitation, while also being the husband who could admit fear and uncertainty to someone who wouldn't weaponize that honesty. But for the first time in 15 years, the possibility of balance felt achievable rather than impossible. Votes. 3 months after the cathedral attack, Blackthorn Keep hosted its first formal gathering since the wedding. Kaedric had recovered enough that standing for extended periods no longer felt like dying. His shoulder retained limited mobility that would probably never fully return, but he'd adapted combat techniques to work around the restriction. The ribs had healed with only occasional aches during weather changes. Physically, he was functional again. Politically, the kingdom had stabilized enough that noble houses felt safe attending events at Blackthorn without fearing immediate execution for imagined slights. The gathering was designed to demonstrate unified support for the Duke and his controversial Duchess. 50 noble families attended, their lords and ladies dressed in formal attire that couldn't quite disguise the nervousness underlying their polite conversations. They remembered what had happened during the last major celebration, remembered the bodies in St. Aurelius Cathedral and the executions that followed. Kaedric stood at the head of the great hall with Seraphina beside him wearing a gown of midnight blue that made her look like someone born to positions of power despite society's previous assessment. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, speaking to nobles who'd ignored her completely 3 months ago and now hung on her every word because dismissing the Duchess of Blackthorn was political suicide. He watched her work with combination of pride and lingering protective instinct that probably wouldn't ever fully disappear. She was capable of managing these situations independently, had proven that repeatedly over the past months. But some part of him would always be scanning for threats and calculating how to eliminate them before they could reach her. That awareness of vulnerability had become a permanent feature of his existence, knowing that someone could hurt him by targeting what he protected. Living with the knowledge that loving Seraphina gave enemies a weapon they'd never possessed when he ruled through fear alone. But the alternative was returning to the isolation that had slowly destroyed his father. And Kaedric had decided months ago that he'd rather face threats with someone worth protecting than rule safely by keeping everyone at distance. Lord Garrett found him standing near the windows watching Seraphina charm a difficult duchess who controlled significant territory in the eastern provinces. The old soldier looked more relaxed than he had in years, the perpetual tension finally easing now that immediate threats had been neutralized. "She's good at this," Garrett observed quietly. "Better than anyone predicted. She spent her entire life watching how power moves through social situations, while everyone assumed she wasn't paying attention." Kedric's voice held genuine respect. "Now she's deploying everything she learned during those years of being invisible. Your father would have approved of the match." The comment surprised him enough that Kaedric turned to look at his oldest advisor directly. "My father would have considered her politically disadvantageous and emotionally compromising." Garrett shook his head slowly. Your father would have recognized that she makes you stronger in ways pure political alliances never could. That having someone who understands both your capacity for violence and your need for connection creates stability that fear alone can't maintain. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I watched your father rule for 40 years, boy. Watched him become increasingly isolated and bitter, despite maintaining perfect order through overwhelming force. And I watched him die alone, wondering whether any of it mattered beyond legacy. You're not going to make that mistake because you found someone willing to stand beside the darkness without being consumed by it. The observation hit deeper than Garrett probably intended, because it articulated something Kaedric had been processing privately for months. The recognition that his father's greatest failure wasn't political or military, it was personal. The choice to sacrifice all human connection for duty until nothing remained except the role and its burdens. I'm terrified of becoming him anyway, Kaedric admitted quietly. Of slowly disappearing into the Duke until Kaedric ceases existing as separate entity. Of looking back in 30 years and realizing I built exactly the same isolated empire he did, despite having opportunities he never accessed. Then don't. Garrett's expression softened. You have something he refused to accept. You have Seraphina who won't let you disappear completely. You have permission to be human with her even when circumstances require you to be ruthless with everyone else. Use that, boy. Let her keep you tethered to something beyond duty and legacy. The old soldier clasped his shoulder once, then moved away to join other advisors near the refreshment tables. And Kaedric remained at the window, processing advice that felt simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. He'd spent so long believing that effective leadership required total sacrifice of personal connection, that vulnerability was weakness to be eliminated rather than strength to be cultivated carefully. His father had modeled that approach perfectly, ruling brilliantly while dying hollow. But Seraphina had shown him a different possibility. That strength could coexist with vulnerability if you chose the right person to be vulnerable with. That ruthlessness remained a viable tool even when you acknowledged it was tool rather than identity. That you could make brutal decisions and carry their weight without being consumed completely by the darkness those choices required. She caught his eye from across the hall and smiled with understanding that said she knew exactly what he was thinking. That reminder that he wasn't alone in carrying this weight anymore. That they were partners in navigating the impossible balance between duty and humanity. Kaedric smiled back, feeling something shift in his chest that had been locked tight since childhood. Not the absence of darkness or brutal necessity, just the recognition that light could exist alongside it if you stopped believing the two were mutually exclusive. Later that night, after guests had departed and servants had cleared the great hall, Kaedric found Seraphina on the battlements overlooking the violent northern sea. She stood wrapped in a cloak against the cold wind, her dark hair whipping around her face while she stared into the darkness. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact felt grounding after hours of political performance and careful mask maintenance. You did well tonight, he said quietly. Several nobles who were skeptical about your capabilities left impressed. I spent my entire life watching how they operate while they assumed I wasn't paying attention. Seraphina's voice held dark humor. Now I use everything I learned during those years of being invisible to manipulate situations they think they control. My devious duchess. Someone has to balance your tendency toward solving problems through overwhelming violence. She leaned against him with comfortable familiarity. We make a good team. You terrify people into compliance. I convince them cooperation serves their interests. Together we maintain order through combination of fear and strategic manipulation. Kaedric absorbed the assessment with grim satisfaction. This was who they'd become over the past months. Not some idealized partnership built on romantic fantasy, but pragmatic alliance between people who understood power's requirements and were willing to deploy whatever methods proved necessary while still preserving their humanity through private moments like this. I love you, he said into the wind, more than I thought myself capable of loving anything. More than duty or legacy or the throne I've spent 15 years defending. I know. Her hand found his in the darkness. And I love you despite knowing exactly what that love costs. Despite understanding that choosing you means living with constant threats and political warfare, and the knowledge that enemies will always try to hurt you by targeting me. She turned to face him directly, the moonlight painting her features in silver and shadow. But here's what I've learned over these months. Loving you doesn't make me weak. It makes me fierce in ways I never was when I spent my life trying to be invisible. because now I have something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. Now I have a future worth protecting through whatever means necessary. The conviction in her voice reminded him of why he'd been drawn to her initially. Not her beauty or political connections or surface compatibility. Her fundamental strength hidden beneath careful invisibility. The capacity to witness darkness and choose to stand beside it rather than flee toward safer options. We're going to survive this, he said with absolute certainty. Whatever threats emerge, whatever political challenges or assassination attempts or conspiracy theories. We're going to face them together and we're going to win because neither of us knows how to surrender when it matters. Agreed. Serafina's smile could have stopped his heart. Now take me inside before we freeze to death standing on these battlements being dramatic. He laughed despite the cold wind and lingering aches from injuries that would probably never fully heal. Then he guided her back toward their chambers with careful deliberation, one hand resting protectively on her lower back. They walked through ancient corridors in comfortable silence, while torches painted shadows across stone walls that had witnessed 8 generations of Ravenshade rulers. Caedric thought about his father dying alone in the war room, thought about his own near death in the cathedral surrounded by violence and blood. And he understood with clarity that felt almost painful that survival wasn't actually the victory. Connection was. Finding someone willing to stand beside the darkness without being consumed. Building a partnership that could sustain the weight of ruling through fear while preserving enough humanity to remember why the protection mattered. That was what separated him from his father's path. Not superior strength or better tactics or more effective ruthlessness. Just the willingness to accept that vulnerability with the right person created foundation rather than weakness. That admitting fear and uncertainty to someone who wouldn't weaponize that honesty was strength of a different kind than he'd been taught to value. Inside their chambers, Serafina helped him remove the formal coat that concealed bandages, still wrapped around his torso where ribs continued healing slowly. Her hands moved with practiced gentleness across scars accumulated over 15 years of combat and political survival. "You're thinking too loudly," she observed while tracing the scar on his cheek with infinite care. "I can practically hear the internal monologue from here, just processing what Garrett said earlier, about how my father would have approved of you, how you keep me tethered to something beyond duty and legacy." "Do you believe him?" Caedric considered the question with characteristic honesty. "I believe my father spent 40 years becoming exactly what circumstances required without building anything personal to sustain him through the brutality. I believe he died hollow, despite ruling brilliantly. And I believe you prevent me from making that same mistake by forcing me to remain human even when being the Duke feels safer than vulnerability." He pulled her close, needing her solid and real against him. "So, yes, I believe Garrett was right. You make me stronger by creating space for weakness. You make the violence bearable by reminding me it's tool rather than identity. You give me reason to survive beyond mere duty or legacy." Serafina's arms came around him with fierce determination. "Then I'll keep doing exactly that. I'll keep calling you on your cruelty when it crosses from necessary into excessive. I'll keep forcing you to be Caedric with me even when staying behind armor feels safer. And I'll keep reminding you that the Duke of Blackthorn is role you perform rather than totality of your existence." Her voice dropped to something barely audible. "Because you're mine now. The same way I'm yours. And I protect what's mine through whatever means necessary. Even when that means protecting you from yourself and the isolation that would destroy you the way it destroyed your father." They stayed like that while moonlight painted patterns across ancient stone and the northern sea continued its eternal assault on the cliffs below. Two people who'd found each other through scandal and violence and political upheaval, who'd survived assassination attempts and public executions in a wedding that became massacre, who'd chosen each other knowing exactly what that choice would cost and deciding the connection was worth the price anyway. 6 months after the cathedral attack, news arrived that fundamentally reshaped Valamont's political landscape. The king had died without producing legitimate heirs, creating succession crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire kingdom. Multiple noble houses began positioning themselves as potential claimants. Regional conflicts erupted as territories chose sides in disputes that would probably require decades to fully resolve. Caedric received the intelligence in his study, while reviewing military expenditure reports that had been accumulating for weeks. Captain Varon delivered the news with grim features that suggested he'd already calculated the implications. "Your Grace, With the king dead and no clear successor, multiple houses are calling for council meeting to determine next steps. Several have suggested that Blackthorn's military strength and demonstrated ability to maintain order make you the logical choice for assuming authority. They want me to take the throne. Kadrick's voice remained absolutely level. To transform from duke into king and thereby consolidate power in ways that would reshape the kingdom completely. Yes, Your Grace. And if I refuse? Then we'll likely face years of civil conflict as various houses compete for position. Thousands will die. Territories will be destroyed. The kingdom will tear itself apart through political warfare that could have been prevented by strong centralized leadership. The weight of that decision settled across Kadrick's shoulders like physical burden. This was what 15 years of brutal efficiency had built toward without him fully realizing it. The reputation for ruthlessness that made people simultaneously fear and need him. The demonstrated capacity to make decisions that maintained order even when those choices required overwhelming violence. He could refuse, could maintain his position as Duke of Blackthorn and let ambitious nobles destroy each other through succession disputes, could protect his territory and his wife and let the rest of the kingdom burn, or he could accept responsibility for stability that extended beyond personal interests, could become king and thereby cement legacy that would survive for generations, while also accepting the increased burden and isolation that came with ultimate authority. "Where is Seraphina?" he asked quietly. "In the gardens, Your Grace." "Shall I summon her?" "No, I'll find her myself." He discovered her exactly where Varon had indicated, standing among winter roses that had somehow survived the first frost. She wore a simple dress without formal ornamentation, her dark hair pulled back loosely. When she saw him approaching, her expression shifted toward concern. Something's happened. Not a question, just observation based on reading his body language after months of practice. The king is dead. Multiple houses want me to assume the throne and prevent succession crisis from destroying the kingdom. Kadrick stopped a few feet away, giving her space to process. If I accept, our lives change fundamentally. More responsibility, more threats, less privacy. Everything we've built over these months gets subsumed into something larger and more complicated. And if you refuse? Civil war. Thousands dead. Decades of instability that could have been prevented. Seraphina absorbed this in thoughtful silence. Finally, she moved closer until she could take his hands in hers with deliberate firmness. "What do you want to do?" The question surprised him, because no one had asked that in years. Everyone assumed the Duke of Blackthorn would make whatever decision tactical necessity required regardless of personal preference. But Seraphina was offering him choice, even when that choice carried implications for both of them. "I want to refuse," he admitted quietly. "Want to maintain what we have here without additional complications. Want to protect you from increased danger that comes with being queen instead of duchess. But refusing means watching the kingdom destroy itself through preventable conflict. Means thousands dying because I prioritize personal comfort over responsibility. I'm actually capable of bearing." His jaw tightened. "I spent 15 years becoming someone who could make brutal decisions, spent months learning to balance ruthlessness with humanity through your influence. And now circumstances are demanding I deploy everything I've become toward preventing catastrophe. So, you're going to accept. I'm going to accept. Unless you tell me not to. Unless you say the cost is too high and you need me to choose our private peace over public responsibility." Seraphina studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled with fierce determination that reminded him why he'd chosen her initially. "I married the Duke of Blackthorn knowing exactly what that meant. Married someone capable of executing 17 conspirators without hesitation. Married a man who would burn kingdoms to protect what he values." Her hands tightened on his. "So if you're asking my permission to become king and thereby prevent civil war, you have it. We'll face whatever comes together the same way we've faced everything else. You'll be queen." The word carried weight that couldn't be understated. Target for every ambitious noble. Focus of constant scrutiny and political maneuvering. Subject to dangers we can't fully predict or prevent. I'm already a target as your duchess. Being queen just means the threats become more explicit. She stepped closer until her forehead rested against his. "We survived this the same way we survived assassination attempts and public executions, and a wedding that became massacre. Together. With you making brutal decisions that maintain order and me reminding you those decisions don't define your entire existence." Kedrick pulled her close despite the lingering ache in his shoulder that would probably never fully disappear. This woman who'd been invisible 6 months ago was now telling him to accept a throne and all its burdens with absolute confidence they'd survive the transformation. That trust was simultaneously gift and responsibility, because it meant she believed in his capacity to bear ultimate authority without being consumed by it. Believed they could maintain their partnership even when circumstances tried forcing them apart through sheer pressure of ruling an entire kingdom instead of single territory. "I love you," he said into her hair. "More than legacy or duty or the throne I'm about to accept, you're the reason any of this remains bearable." "I know." She pressed a kiss against his jaw with infinite gentleness. "Now let's go prevent a civil war and figure out how to be king and queen without losing ourselves completely in the process." But bum. The coronation happened 3 months later in St. Aurelius Cathedral, the same building where their wedding had become bloodbath. Ciedric insisted on the location despite protests from advisors who thought the association with violence was politically disadvantageous. But he wanted the symbolism explicit. Wanted everyone attending to remember what happened to conspirators who challenged Blackthorn authority. The ceremony was heavily guarded with soldiers positioned throughout the cathedral in configurations that would allow rapid response to any threat. Captain Varon coordinated security personally, his expression grim with determination that no repeat of the wedding attack would happen on his watch. Ciedric stood at the altar wearing formal black and silver that somehow made him look more dangerous than regal. The crown sat on a velvet cushion nearby, ancient symbol of authority that had passed through generations of rulers. He stared at it while the officiant delivered traditional speeches about duty and legacy and responsibility. But his focus kept returning to Serafina, who stood beside him wearing a gown of deep crimson that made her look like someone born for this position despite spending most of her life invisible. She met his gaze with steady confidence that said they were in this together regardless of what came next. The officiant finally lifted the crown and placed it on Ciedric's head with ceremonial precision. The weight was significant but not unbearable. Physical reminder of authority he'd just accepted and all its implications. "Long live King Ciedric," the officiant declared, his voice echoing through the vaulted cathedral. "Long live the king," 200 nobles repeated in unison, their voices carrying mixture of hope and fear. Then Serafina was crowned queen with similar ceremony, and Ciedric watched her transformation from invisible younger daughter to ruler of an entire kingdom feel simultaneously inevitable and impossible. She wore the authority with natural grace that came from years of careful observation. And he understood with absolute certainty that she would be extraordinary at this role, the same way she'd been extraordinary at everything else she attempted. The celebration afterward was carefully controlled, no alcohol beyond supervised amounts. Every guest searched thoroughly before entry. Guards stationed at intervals close enough to respond within seconds to any threat. But the evening passed without incident, and by midnight, Ciedric and Serafina were alone in royal chambers that had been prepared for their arrival. They stood together on the balcony overlooking the capital, with the weight of crowns literally resting on their heads, and the metaphorical burden of an entire kingdom pressing down on their shoulders. "We did it," Serafina said quietly. "We survived everything circumstances threw at us, and we're still standing." "Together," Ciedric corrected. "We're still standing together. That's what matters." He removed his crown with careful deliberation and set it aside. Then he removed hers with the same gentleness, placing both symbols of authority on a nearby table. For this moment, they were just Ciedric and Serafina, rather than king and queen. "I need you to know something," he said while pulling her close. "Everything I've become, everything I'm going to do as king, all the brutal decisions and political maneuvering and strategic violence, none of it matters if I lose you in the process. You're not going to lose me. Promise me anyway. Promise that if I start disappearing into the role the way my father did, you'll call me back. That you won't let me sacrifice our partnership for duty, regardless of how necessary that sacrifice might seem politically." Serafina's arms came around him with fierce determination. "I promise. I'll keep reminding you that King Ciedric is role you perform, rather than totality of your existence. I'll keep forcing you to be human with me even when staying behind armor feels safer. And I'll keep loving you despite and because of the complicated reality of who you actually are." They stood like that while moonlight painted the capital in silver and shadow. Two people who'd found each other through scandal and violence, who'd survived assassination attempts and become rulers of an entire kingdom, who'd chosen each other knowing exactly what that choice would cost and deciding the connection was worth any price. Years later, historians would write about King Cedric Ravensshade as one of the most ruthless and effective rulers in Valamont's history. They would document his brutal military campaigns and political executions and the fear he inspired across every territory. They would analyze his tactical brilliance and administrative efficiency and the legacy he built through overwhelming force. But they would also write about Queen Seraphina, the invisible daughter who became the most influential political force of her generation, who balanced her husband's ruthlessness with strategic compassion, who proved that strength and vulnerability weren't contradictions but complementary aspects of effective leadership. And those who looked closely enough would understand that neither ruler could have succeeded without the other, that the king's capacity for violence was tempered by the queen's humanity, that her political acumen was protected by his willingness to eliminate threats without hesitation. Together they ruled for 40 years, maintaining order through combination of fear and strategic manipulation that previous generations had never achieved. They produced 3 children who inherited both parents' strengths. They transformed Blackthorn Keep into the kingdom's political and cultural center. But more importantly, they proved something that Cedric's father had never understood. That power didn't require isolation. That vulnerability with the right person created foundation rather than weakness. That you could make brutal decisions and carry their weight without being consumed completely by the darkness those choices required. On his deathbed decades later, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his legacy forward, Cedric would look at Seraphina sitting beside him and understand that he'd succeeded where his father had failed. Not through superior tactics or more effective ruthlessness, simply through choosing connection over isolation and trusting that love could coexist with leadership. "You saved me," he would whisper while holding her hand with the last of his strength, "not from enemies or political threats, from becoming exactly what my father was. Brilliant and brutal and completely hollow." And Seraphina would smile with the same understanding she'd shown that first night beneath the marble archway when he'd seen her standing in shadows. Would squeeze his hand and remind him that they'd saved each other. That partnership had always been the foundation allowing them to bear impossible burdens without breaking. That was the truth historians could never fully capture. The human reality beneath crowns and political legacies. 2 people who'd found each other when they needed it most and built something stronger than either could have achieved alone. Not some fairy tale about love conquering all. Just the messy, complicated reality of choosing connection over isolation and learning to balance ruthlessness with humanity through constant practice and mutual support. That was King Cedric Ravenshade's true legacy. Not the military victories or political reforms or territorial expansion. The fact that he'd ruled brilliantly for 40 years while never becoming the isolated monster his position could have created. Because Queen Seraphina had never stopped reminding him that the Duke of Blackthorn, the King of Valamont, the ruthless strategist who'd executed 17 conspirators without hesitation, was just one aspect of who he actually was, and that the man underneath all those masks was worth protecting through whatever means necessary, even from himself.